Imagine a person who has just completed their first online course in a particular field, perhaps web design or amateur psychology, and they emerge from that experience convinced they have mastered the subject to a degree that rivals professionals with decades of experience, confidently offering unsolicited advice to experts and dismissing nuanced perspectives they don't yet have the framework to understand. This person is experiencing what researchers David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger first documented in the late 1990s, a phenomenon where individuals with limited knowledge or skill in a domain suffer from a profound blind spot regarding the true depth and complexity of that domain, leading them to dramatically overestimate their own competence while simultaneously underestimating how much they still have to learn. The psychological mechanism underlying this distortion operates on a double bind. People lack the foundational knowledge required to accurately assess what competence actually looks like, so they cannot recognize the gaps in their own understanding, and simultaneously, the confidence that comes from their initial learning creates a subjective feeling of expertise that feels entirely authentic and justified from the inside. As someone learns more about a field, they gradually recognize the vast landscape of complexity they were previously unaware of, which paradoxically causes their confidence to dip even as their actual competence rises, a phenomenon sometimes called the Valley of Humility, until eventually, with sufficient expertise, their confidence calibrates more accurately to their genuine abilities. What makes this distortion particularly persistent in human decision-making is that it operates silently, requiring no external validation to feel completely real, and it thrives in environments where information is abundant but depth is rare, where skimming the surface of multiple topics creates an illusion of understanding, while actual mastery requires years of deliberate practice and exposure to one's own repeated failures and limitations. When we look at successful entrepreneurs, we often hear their stories of perseverance, bold decisions, and unwavering confidence in their vision, and we conclude that these are the defining characteristics that led to their success. We read about Steve Jobs returning to Apple or Oprah rising from poverty to become a media mogul, and we extract lessons from their journeys as if they represent some universal blueprint for achievement. However, what we are not seeing are the thousands of entrepreneurs who possessed identical characteristics, who made equally bold decisions, and who maintained the same level of confidence and perseverance, yet whose businesses failed spectacularly or never gained traction at all. Survivorship bias is the tendency to focus exclusively on the successes that have survived some process of selection while overlooking the failures that did not make it through, leading us to draw conclusions based on an incomplete and fundamentally skewed dataset. This cognitive distortion operates quietly in almost every domain of human experience, from business and investing to medicine, education, and personal relationships. When we examine only the people who survived a plane crash to understand what they did differently, we miss the crucial fact that most of those decisions made no difference at all, and countless other people who made identical choices perished. The mechanism behind survivorship bias is deceptively simple. Successful outcomes are visible and memorable, while failures often disappear from view, become forgotten, or exist in such vast numbers that they never register in our collective consciousness. Our brains are naturally drawn to narrative and pattern recognition, and when we encounter a success story, we instinctively want to identify the causal factors that produced that outcome, attributing the result to specific actions or qualities rather than acknowledging the role of randomness, timing, and statistical probability. Imagine you have spent 3 years working toward a degree in a field that no longer interests you, investing thousands of dollars in tuition, countless hours in study, and emotional energy in pursuit of a goal that once seemed meaningful but now fills you with dread. You are offered an opportunity to change direction entirely, to pursue something that genuinely excites you, yet you find yourself hesitating, thinking about all that time and money already spent, all those sacrifices already made. The rational choice would be to evaluate your options based on what will serve you best moving forward, yet instead you remain bound to the past investment, unable to walk away from something that was already lost the moment your passion faded. This is the sunk cost fallacy, and it operates across every domain of human decision-making with remarkable consistency. The mechanism at work involves a fundamental confusion about how decisions should be made. Our minds treat past investments as though they should influence future choices, when logically only present circumstances and future consequences should matter. Once money is spent or time is invested, it becomes sunk, meaning it cannot be recovered regardless of what choices we make next. A rational decision maker would ignore these past costs entirely and consider only what lies ahead, yet we cannot seem to do this naturally. We have evolved to value consistency and to minimize perceived waste, which once served us well in environments where resources were genuinely limited and waste truly meant suffering. Now, in modern life where we have documented our investments, tracked our expenses, and made our commitments visible to ourselves and others, we have created a psychological prison where abandonment feels like admission of failure. We continue investing in bad relationships, unprofitable business ventures, unenjoyable careers, and unsatisfying hobbies simply because we have already invested so much. Society reinforces this pattern by praising persistence and commitment while stigmatizing change and course correction. Imagine you have just decided that a particular political candidate is the right choice for office, and from that moment forward, every news article you encounter, every social media post that crosses your feed, and every conversation you have with friends seems to reinforce your original decision with uncanny precision. You notice the candidate's strengths repeatedly while somehow overlooking or minimizing their weaknesses, and when confronted with evidence that contradicts your chosen position, you find yourself scrutinizing that evidence far more critically than you scrutinized the information that supported your view. This is confirmation bias, one of the most pervasive and consequential distortions in human thinking, and it operates so silently and thoroughly that we rarely notice its influence on our judgment. The mechanism behind confirmation bias is fundamentally about how our brains process information once we have committed to a belief or decision. Once you have formed an opinion, your mind essentially begins filtering the world through that lens, actively seeking out information that aligns with what you already believe while simultaneously dismissing, reinterpreting, or simply failing to notice information that contradicts your position. This is not a conscious conspiracy against truth, but rather an unconscious efficiency strategy that our brains employ to reduce cognitive load and maintain psychological consistency. We have limited mental resources, and the brain has evolved to conserve energy by avoiding the discomfort of contradiction and the effort required to genuinely reconsider established beliefs. What makes confirmation bias particularly insidious is that it operates even when we consider ourselves rational, objective thinkers, and even when we are genuinely trying to make the best possible decision. A scientist reviewing data, a doctor diagnosing a patient, a hiring manager evaluating candidates, and a juror deliberating in a courtroom all fall prey to confirmation bias with remarkable regularity. Imagine you encounter information that directly contradicts your deeply held beliefs, and instead of reconsidering your position, you actually become more entrenched in your original view, clinging to it with even greater conviction than before. This is the backfire effect, a cognitive distortion where exposure to contradictory evidence produces the opposite of the intended persuasive outcome. Consider a person who believes a particular medical treatment is dangerous receiving a peer-reviewed study showing its safety and efficacy. Rather than updating their belief, they might dismiss the research as fraudulent or biased and subsequently become more adamant that the treatment is harmful. The mechanism underlying this distortion is rooted in the brain's fundamental need to maintain cognitive consistency and protect its established worldview. When we encounter information that threatens our core beliefs, psychological discomfort emerges, a state known as cognitive dissonance, and our mind responds by activating defensive reasoning patterns that rationalize away the threatening evidence rather than integrating it. We construct elaborate counterarguments, question the credibility of sources, or selectively attend to information that supports our existing positions while filtering out contradictory data. Over time, this protective mechanism can actually strengthen the false belief because we invest emotional energy into defending it, making it increasingly central to our identity and self-concept. What makes the backfire effect particularly insidious is that it persists even when we are intellectually aware of our own biases, suggesting that rational intention alone cannot override these deeper psychological safeguards. We have normalized this tendency by framing disagreement as personal attack, by surrounding ourselves with like-minded individuals who reinforce our views, and by retreating into ideological communities where challenging information is pre-filtered. Consider the moment when someone asks you to explain how a zipper works, or how a toilet flushes, or what makes the internet function on a fundamental level. Most people feel confident that they understand these mechanisms until forced to articulate the details, at which point their confidence collapses into hesitation and incomplete descriptions. This is the illusion of explanatory depth, a cognitive distortion where we overestimate our understanding of complex systems, processes, and concepts, believing we comprehend them far better than we actually do. The distortion operates silently in countless domains of our lives, from how we think we understand political ideologies we support to our conviction that we grasp the economic principles underlying inflation, from our confidence in understanding how vaccines work to our presumed knowledge of why our relationships succeed or fail. We navigate through existence operating under the false impression that we possess genuine understanding when we possess only shallow familiarity combined with confidence born from repeated exposure. The psychological mechanism underlying this distortion appears to stem from a fundamental confusion between recognition and comprehension, where encountering something frequently creates the sensation of understanding it deeply. When we have heard terms repeatedly, seen images associated with concepts, or absorbed culturally transmitted explanations, our brains generate a feeling of fluency and mastery that feels identical to actual understanding. This fluency becomes misattributed as genuine comprehension, creating an illusion so powerful that we rarely question it until directly confronted with the requirement to explain something in precise detail. We have normalized this distortion so thoroughly within our decision-making processes that we routinely make significant choices based on this illusory understanding. Selecting political positions, endorsing complex policies, making medical decisions, or investing resources based on what we believe we understand about systems we have never truly examined deeply. Imagine a room where 10 people sit in a circle, each one convinced that they are the least biased person present, while simultaneously believing that nearly everyone else in the room is trapped by their own prejudices and blind spots. This is the paradox of bias blind spot, a cognitive distortion so pervasive that it affects our judgment across virtually every domain of decision-making, yet remains almost entirely invisible to those experiencing it. The mechanism works like this. We possess an intuitive ability to recognize bias in others with remarkable ease, spotting logical fallacies, motivated reasoning, and selective evidence, gathering in their arguments and choices with almost effortless clarity. We notice when our colleague dismisses information that contradicts their political beliefs, or when our family member rationalizes a poor financial decision by ignoring contradictory data, or when our friend refuses to acknowledge their role in a failed relationship because they have constructed a narrative where they are blameless. Yet when we examine our own reasoning processes, our own decisions, our own interpretations of evidence, we see only objective analysis and sound judgment. The psychological foundation of this distortion rests on the asymmetry between how we evaluate ourselves and how we evaluate others, compounded by the fact that our biases operate largely outside conscious awareness. We cannot easily perceive the filters through which we process information, the assumptions we make without questioning, or the evidence we dismiss because it feels wrong rather than because it lacks merit. This creates a profound paradox where the very mechanism that allows us to identify bias in others prevents us from recognizing it in ourselves. What perpetuates this distortion across years and decades is that we rarely receive clear, undeniable feedback about our own biases, while we constantly accumulate evidence of others' irrationality. Imagine walking into a crowded coffee shop wearing a shirt with a small stain on it that you noticed just as you were leaving your house, and from that moment forward, you become convinced that every person in that room is looking at you, judging you, analyzing that blemish with the same intensity that you are analyzing it in your own mind. You sit down at a table and feel the weight of invisible eyes upon you, certain that your flaw is the center of everyone's attention, the primary focus of their cognitive bandwidth, when in reality most of the people surrounding you are absorbed in their own conversations, their own phones, their own internal worlds and concerns. This is the spotlight effect, a cognitive distortion where we systematically overestimate the degree to which other people notice, care about, and judge our appearance, behavior, and mistakes. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in what psychologists call egocentric bias, which is our natural tendency to view the world primarily from our own perspective, and to assume that what is salient and important to us is equally salient and important to everyone else around us. When you notice that stain or make an awkward comment in a meeting, it becomes the focal point of your attention, it occupies your working memory, it feels significant and noticeable, and your mind commits what researchers call the curse of knowledge by assuming that others possess the same information and concern that you do. We persist in this distortion despite its logical inconsistency because our own minds remain forever our primary theater of experience, and we struggle to truly internalize the fact that other people are equally preoccupied with their own lives, their own insecurities, their own mistakes, and that we occupy far less of their mental real estate than we imagine. This bias has been normalized throughout human society because it drives certain prosocial behaviors, anxiety about our presentation, and motivation to maintain standards, yet it simultaneously generates unnecessary self-consciousness and decision paralysis that serves no adaptive purpose. Imagine you send an email to your manager with a small typo, and within moments your mind has constructed an elaborate narrative in which your boss reads that email, questions your competence, decides you are not suitable for your role, and by the end of the week you have been terminated, your career is in ruins, and you are unable to find employment anywhere else. This is catastrophizing, the cognitive pattern where we take a minor negative event or a small mistake and rapidly escalate it through a chain of imagined worst-case scenarios until we arrive at total disaster. The actual event is minimal, perhaps insignificant in the broader context of our lives, yet our minds have transformed it into something catastrophic through pure imagination and extrapolation. The psychological mechanism underlying this distortion operates through what researchers call emotional reasoning combined with probability distortion. When we experience anxiety or fear in response to a triggering event, our brain mistakes the intensity of that emotional response as evidence that something truly terrible is about to occur. We confuse the feeling of danger with the actual presence of danger, and then our mind works backward, constructing a plausible chain of consequences that would justify why we feel so terrified. Our attention narrows to only the negative possibilities while dismissing the far more likely positive or neutral outcomes. We become skilled storytellers of disaster, weaving details and connections that make catastrophe seem inevitable. What is remarkable is how normalized this pattern has become in modern life, how we discuss our catastrophic thoughts as though they are reasonable predictions rather than imagination dressed up as prophecy. We share our catastrophic worries with others, and they validate them by sharing their own, creating a collective acceptance that the worst is always just around the corner. We have built entire industries and media ecosystems around catastrophizing, platforms that profit by amplifying our fears and worst-case scenarios. Imagine you are an expert pianist who has spent 20 years mastering your craft, and someone asks you to teach a complete beginner how to play a simple melody. You sit down at the keyboard and find yourself frustrated when the student struggles with concepts that seem so obvious to you, so intuitive and second nature that you struggle to remember what it felt like not to understand them. This is the curse of knowledge, a cognitive distortion where possessing deep expertise or familiarity with a subject makes it nearly impossible to remember or relate to the perspective of someone encountering that same material for the first time. Once you know something, truly know it, your brain has integrated that knowledge so thoroughly into your existing mental frameworks that the path you took to understanding it becomes invisible to you, and you unconsciously assume that others can see what you see with equal clarity and immediacy. When an engineer explains technical specifications using jargon that seems perfectly logical and straightforward to them, they cannot genuinely access the confusion of a user encountering those terms for the first time, because their brain no longer processes this information in a step-by-step manner, but rather as an instantaneous recognition pattern. This distortion operates through the mechanism of automaticity and memory interference, wherein the knowledge you have acquired becomes so embedded in your cognitive processing that you cannot selectively retrieve the state of not knowing. Your brain has optimized for efficiency, consolidating vast amounts of information into intuitive leaps and shortcuts, which means the intermediate steps and foundational building blocks that made the learning possible have been compressed and hidden from conscious awareness. Parents often fall victim to this when they become frustrated with their children's inability to understand concepts that they themselves found simple, not recognizing that they have had years or decades of accumulated context and prerequisite knowledge that the child simply does not possess. Imagine a person who suffers a devastating accident through no fault of their own, yet those around them begin to speculate about what they might have done to deserve such misfortune, searching for moral explanations where none logically exist. Alternatively, consider a wealthy individual who attributes their success entirely to their virtue and hard work, completely overlooking the circumstances of their birth, their access to education, and the countless fortunate events that compounded their advantages over time. The just world hypothesis is the deeply ingrained cognitive distortion that leads us to believe the world operates according to a perfectly balanced moral ledger, where good people are rewarded and bad people are punished, where effort always produces proportional results, and where outcomes fundamentally reflect deserving. This belief system creates a psychological framework in which we interpret reality through the lens of cosmic fairness, assuming that if something happened to someone, they must have done something to warrant it. The mechanism behind this distortion operates at a profound emotional level because believing in a just world provides us with an enormous sense of safety and control over our circumstances. When we accept that outcomes are determined by moral merit rather than random chance, systemic inequality, or blind luck, we create a comforting illusion that life is predictable and manageable. If we believe good things happen to good people, then by extension, as long as we remain virtuous and hardworking, we ourselves will remain protected from tragedy and misfortune. This psychological security comes at an enormous cost to our judgment and our empathy. We begin to blame victims for their circumstances, assuming that homeless individuals must lack sufficient work ethic, that people with serious illnesses must have made poor lifestyle choices, or that those living in poverty must lack intelligence or ambition. We normalize injustice by attributing it to moral failings rather than recognizing systemic barriers, discrimination, and the role of pure chance in determining human outcomes. Imagine a homeowner living in a flood-prone area who has experienced minor flooding 3 times in the past decade, yet continues to store irreplaceable documents and family heirlooms in the basement without any protective measures whatsoever. When asked why they haven't moved their belongings to higher ground or invested in waterproofing, they respond that flooding has always happened before and life has always returned to normal, so there is no reason to believe this time will be different or worse. This person is experiencing normalcy bias, a cognitive distortion in which we assume that life will continue exactly as it has in the past, and that disruptive events or significant changes are far less likely to occur than statistical evidence might suggest. Normalcy bias operates through a deeply rooted psychological mechanism that anchors our expectations to our personal history rather than to objective probability. Our brains are pattern recognition machines designed to learn from repetition, and when we have lived through many cycles of a particular outcome, we unconsciously weight our past experiences far more heavily than we should when assessing future risk. The human mind evolved in environments where historical patterns were often reliable predictors of immediate threats, and this ancient survival mechanism persists even in modern contexts where the rules have fundamentally changed. We observe that dangerous situations in our lives have resolved themselves before, so we develop an almost irrational confidence that they will resolve themselves again, creating a psychological buffer between ourselves and the anxiety that true uncertainty would generate. What makes normalcy bias particularly insidious is that it persists even among intelligent, educated individuals who consciously understand probability and statistics, because the distortion operates at an emotional and intuitive level rather than a purely rational one. Consider the true historical case of Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in Vienna during the 1840s, who discovered through careful observation and data collection that requiring doctors to wash their hands with chlorinated lime between examining corpses and delivering babies dramatically reduced maternal mortality rates in his maternity ward. Yet when he presented this finding to the medical establishment of his time, he was met not with gratitude or scientific curiosity, but with fierce rejection, ridicule, and professional ostracism, ultimately leading to his institutionalization and death, a tragic outcome that reveals a fundamental cognitive distortion in human psychology known as the Semmelweis Reflex. This reflex describes our tendency to reject new evidence or knowledge simply because it contradicts established norms, existing beliefs, institutional practices, or our deeply held convictions about how the world works, regardless of the quality or validity of that evidence. When we encounter information that challenges our existing worldview or threatens the legitimacy of institutions we have trusted, our minds do not simply weigh the evidence objectively and update our understanding. Instead, we experience a visceral defensive reaction, experiencing discomfort, cognitive dissonance, and an almost automatic impulse to dismiss, minimize, or attack the source of this challenging information. The mechanism operates through several interconnected psychological processes. Our attachment to established systems and authorities that have structured our understanding of reality, our investment in being right and maintaining consistency in our beliefs, our fear of institutional disruption or personal obsolescence, and our reliance on consensus as a proxy for truth, all of which combine to create a powerful barrier against genuine innovation and paradigm-shifting discoveries. Consider the moment when a colleague arrives late to an important meeting, disrupting the conversation and forcing everyone to pause while they settle in. Your immediate internal response is likely that they are irresponsible, disorganized, or do not respect your time. You construct a narrative around their character, assuming their tardiness reflects something fundamental about who they are as a person. Yet what you do not see is the reality behind closed doors, the unexpected phone call from their child's school, the traffic accident that blocked their usual route, or the urgent email that demanded their attention just as they were leaving their office. This is the fundamental attribution error in action, a cognitive bias so pervasive that it shapes how we interpret nearly every human interaction we witness. The mechanism underlying this distortion is surprisingly simple. When we observe another person's behavior, we have immediate access to their actions, but not to their circumstances, pressures, or internal constraints. Our minds, seeking efficiency, default to explaining behavior through personality traits and character dispositions rather than through the situational factors we cannot readily perceive. We assume that what we see is what they are, rather than recognizing that context is often the primary driver of human action. This bias becomes particularly powerful because it operates almost invisibly, embedded so deeply within our everyday interpretive habits that we rarely question its validity. We have normalized this error to such an extent that our social conversations are filled with character judgments about people whose actual circumstances remain entirely unknown to us. We blame rather than inquire, we judge rather than investigate, and we construct identities for others based on isolated snapshots of their behavior, while remaining completely unaware of the larger picture that would provide genuine understanding. Imagine walking into a clothing store where you see a jacket displayed with a price tag of $399 slashed through in red, replaced by a new price of $149. Your immediate reaction is that you have found an exceptional bargain, and you feel compelled to purchase the item before this incredible deal disappears. The first number you encountered, the original price, has fundamentally shaped your perception of value and your decision-making process that follows, even though you have no actual knowledge of whether that original price was ever real or justified. This is the anchoring effect, one of the most pervasive and influential cognitive distortions that operates silently in nearly every decision involving valuation, negotiation, or judgment that you will make throughout your life. The anchoring effect occurs because our minds use the first piece of numerical information we receive as a reference point, a mental anchor, from which all subsequent judgments are calculated and adjusted. When you encounter that initial number, your brain does not discard it after forming your first impression. Instead, it remains cognitively available and accessible, serving as the gravitational center around which your thinking orbits. Even when you intellectually recognize that an anchor might be arbitrary or manipulative, the effect persists because the anchoring happens at a level of processing that precedes conscious deliberation and rational analysis. This distortion is so fundamental to human cognition that it influences salary negotiations, real estate purchases, medical diagnoses, legal judgments, and even scientific research. In salary negotiations, the first number proposed by either party becomes the psychological baseline from which both parties adjust their expectations, meaning that whoever speaks first has already won a significant psychological advantage. Imagine you're sitting in your living room after watching a news segment about a plane crash that killed 200 people, and suddenly you feel a surge of anxiety about your upcoming flight. In that same moment, you scroll through your phone and see a statistic showing that you're far more likely to die in a car accident on your way to the airport than you are to perish in an aviation disaster. Yet the fear persists because the vivid imagery of the crash is still fresh in your mind. This is the availability heuristic at work, a cognitive shortcut where your brain assesses the probability or frequency of events based primarily on how easily examples come to mind rather than on actual statistical reality. When something is recent, emotionally charged, or widely publicized, your mind treats it as more common and more likely to occur than it actually is, because those memorable instances are readily available in your consciousness. You make decisions about risk, likelihood, and importance based on what you can most easily recall rather than on comprehensive data or true probability. The mechanism operates because your brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine that evolved to prioritize immediate, vivid threats for survival purposes, and in the modern world where information is abundant and emotional stimulation is constant, this ancient adaptation now works against accurate judgment. Your mind creates a mental simulation of danger when you can vividly imagine an outcome, and that imaginability feels like evidence of likelihood, even though the ease of recall says nothing about actual frequency. We have normalized this distortion so thoroughly that entire industries exploit it, from news media outlets that sensationalize rare events to marketers who flood you with memorable advertisements, because they understand that what sticks in your mind determines what you believe and what you purchase and what you fear. Imagine you are presented with a simple choice. You can either accept a guaranteed gain of $500 or you can take a 50% chance of winning $1,000 while risking nothing if you lose. Most people choose the guaranteed money, even though the expected value of the gamble is identical. Now reverse the scenario. You must either accept a guaranteed loss of $500 or take a 50% chance of losing $1,000. Suddenly, people become risk-takers, preferring the gamble to the certain loss. This asymmetry reveals something fundamental about human decision-making that shapes nearly every choice we face, from financial investments to career changes to relationship commitments. Loss aversion is the cognitive distortion wherein the psychological pain of losing something feels roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining an equivalent amount. This phenomenon operates at the foundation of our decision-making apparatus, influencing us to avoid losses more aggressively than we pursue gains, even when the mathematics clearly favors the opposite approach. The mechanism behind this distortion is partly evolutionary and partly learned through experience. Our ancestors who were overly cautious about losing resources like food, shelter, and status were more likely to survive and reproduce than those who gambled recklessly, so natural selection may have biased us toward loss prevention. Additionally, we become psychologically attached to things we own or expect to own, a phenomenon called the Endowment Effect, which makes losses feel more significant than they objectively are. This distortion persists despite our logical capacity to recognize it, because emotions override calculation when stakes feel personal and real. We hold losing stocks far longer than we should because selling locks in the loss, even though the money would serve us better elsewhere. We remain in unfulfilling careers for decades because the fear of losing our familiar salary and status outweighs our desire to pursue something more meaningful. Imagine sitting in a meeting where a colleague made a decision that ultimately led to significant losses for the company. In the weeks following the announcement of this failure, colleagues gather around the water cooler and say things like, "I knew that was going to happen," or "It was obvious from the start that this wouldn't work out." Yet if you trace back to the moment before the decision was made, these same people offered no objection, raised no concerns, and perhaps even supported the initiative with enthusiasm. This phenomenon, where the past appears far more predictable than it actually was at the time it unfolded, is called hindsight bias, and it operates as one of the most pervasive distortions in human cognition. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about how our minds reconstruct memory and meaning after events have concluded. When we learn the outcome of a past event, our brains automatically begin reweaving the narrative of how we perceived things beforehand, unconsciously editing out the uncertainty that genuinely existed at that moment in time. Our current knowledge of what happened becomes a lens through which we reinterpret all the information we possessed earlier, creating a false sense of inevitability that was never present in the original circumstances. This distortion is so powerful because it feels like genuine memory and genuine prediction. We do not experience it as false reconstruction, but rather as the straightforward recollection of what we always believed. The persistence of hindsight bias, despite its logical inconsistency, suggests something profound about how human memory prioritizes narrative coherence over accuracy. We are built to tell stories that make sense in retrospect, rather than to preserve the genuine uncertainty that characterized our experience at the moment of decision. This bias influences every consequential choice we make, because it systematically teaches us incorrect lessons about what we could have known and what we should have seen coming, leading us to make overconfident predictions about future events. Imagine walking into a job interview where the candidate is exceptionally attractive, well-dressed, and has an engaging smile from the moment they enter the room. Throughout the entire conversation, you find yourself rating their answers more favorably than you might have otherwise, glossing over inconsistencies in their responses and interpreting ambiguous statements in the most positive light possible. When they finish speaking, you lean back in your chair convinced that you have just met an outstanding candidate, someone who would be perfect for the role. Later, when you review the transcript of the interview with fresh eyes, you notice that the actual content of their answers was vague, their experience was thinner than you initially thought, and their technical knowledge was questionable. Yet somehow, in the moment, their overall presentation created such a powerful positive impression that it colored your perception of every individual element. This is the halo effect in motion. The halo effect occurs when our overall impression of a person, brand, or entity becomes so dominant in our minds that it influences how we perceive their specific attributes and qualities. When we encounter someone or something that strikes us as generally positive or impressive, we unconsciously allow that singular positive quality to shine like a halo, casting a favorable glow over every other aspect of their character or capabilities. A person might be physically attractive, charismatic, or successful in one domain, and we automatically assume they are also intelligent, trustworthy, kind, and competent in completely unrelated areas. The mechanism underlying this distortion is rooted in our cognitive need for consistency and our limited mental resources. Our brains are constantly overwhelmed with information, and they have evolved to take shortcuts to reduce the cognitive load. Rather than meticulously evaluating each quality independently, we rely on a single standout characteristic to serve as a proxy for overall quality. If someone is beautiful, successful, or famous, our minds default to assuming they must also be good at many other things. Imagine walking into a job interview where the candidate arrives 5 minutes late, and immediately the hiring manager's entire perception shifts in a negative direction. Not only does this lateness now color how they interpret every answer the candidate gives, but it also influences their assessment of qualities that have nothing to do with punctuality, such as the candidate's technical expertise, creativity, or problem-solving ability. This is the horn effect in action, the cognitive distortion where a single negative characteristic or behavior causes us to view an entire person, product, or situation through a predominantly negative lens, contaminating all our subsequent judgments and evaluations. The horn effect operates through a psychological mechanism known as the halo effect's inverse, where one salient negative trait becomes so cognitively dominant that it functions as a filter through which all other information must pass, effectively dimming our ability to perceive positive or neutral qualities with any real clarity or objectivity. When we encounter something negative about someone or something, our brain essentially stamps that negative trait as the primary organizing principle for how we will interpret future interactions and evidence. And this happens so automatically and seamlessly that we rarely notice we are doing it at all. A person might be known for a single mistake they made years ago, yet that singular failure continues to overshadow their numerous subsequent successes, competencies, and character strengths. Because our mind has already decided that the negative information is the most important information and therefore the most relevant to all future assessments. We persist in this distortion despite its logical inconsistency because our brain has evolved to prioritize threats and negativity as survival mechanisms. And this ancient wiring still dominates our thinking even in modern contexts where a person's lateness or one poor performance has no bearing whatsoever on their other capabilities or qualities. When you estimate how long a project will take, you almost invariably underestimate the time required, even when you have completed similar projects in the past and know precisely how long they actually took. This is planning fallacy, and it operates with such consistency that it defies the logic of experience itself. Consider the professional who has submitted late reports for the past 5 years, each time swearing that this project will be different, that somehow this particular deadline will be met despite identical circumstances and identical patterns of delay. Consider the homeowner renovating a kitchen who budgets 3 weeks for the job despite knowing that every previous home improvement project has taken twice as long as planned. Mechanism operates through a peculiar distortion in how we process information about time and complexity. When we plan a future task, our minds tend to focus narrowly on the specific project at hand, filtering out or minimizing the countless variables, interruptions, unforeseen complications, and trivial delays that inevitably accumulate in real life. We construct what psychologists call an idealized scenario, a best-case narrative where everything proceeds smoothly without friction. Simultaneously, we discount or ignore the statistical evidence from our own past experience, treating previous delays as anomalies rather than reliable data points. The planning fallacy persists with remarkable tenacity precisely because it operates at the intersection of optimism and abstraction. When we think about the future, we inhabit a realm of possibility rather than concrete reality, and in this realm, we are instinctively optimistic about our own capabilities and the cooperativeness of external circumstances. We have normalized this distortion so thoroughly that missing deadlines has become an accepted feature of organizational life, yet we rarely connect these systemic failures to the cognitive bias that generates them. Consider the investor who meticulously tracks market movements, believing that their careful analysis and constant monitoring directly influence whether their portfolio gains or loses value, when in reality, the vast forces of global economics, geopolitical events, and millions of other traders' decisions are far beyond their sphere of influence. Yet they persist in their detailed spreadsheets and daily reviews with absolute conviction that their attention and strategy matter more than statistical probability. This is the illusion of control, a cognitive distortion in which we systematically overestimate the degree to which we can influence outcomes that are partially or entirely dependent on factors outside our direct power. The mechanism operates through a fundamental misalignment between our need for agency and the actual architecture of causality in the world around us. Our brains have evolved to detect patterns and to create narratives of cause and effect, because in many domains of life, our actions genuinely do produce consequences, and this adaptive tendency becomes pathological when we extend it beyond its appropriate domain. We confuse correlation with causation, we attribute luck to skill, and we mistake activity for effectiveness, finding comfort in the illusion that if we simply work harder, plan better, or remain more vigilant, we can control what is fundamentally uncontrollable. The persistence of this distortion is remarkable precisely because logic should eliminate it, yet it thrives even in highly educated individuals who consciously understand probability and randomness, because the emotional reward of believing in our control is so powerful that it overrides intellectual acknowledgement of our limitations. We would rather believe ourselves responsible for failures we cannot prevent than accept the anxiety of genuine powerlessness, and we would rather attribute our successes to our own brilliance than acknowledge the role of chance, creating a motivated reasoning system that continuously reinforces the illusion even as evidence contradicts it at every turn. Imagine you're sitting at a roulette table and the ball has landed on black 9 times in a row. Your instinct screams that red is now due to appear, that the odds have shifted in your favor, that the universe owes you a win after such an improbable streak. You place your money on red with confidence, certain that probability demands a change. This is the gambler's fallacy, one of the most persistent and costly distortions in human decision-making, and it operates across far more domains than just casinos. The mechanism behind this fallacy is deceptively simple yet profoundly illogical. Each spin of the roulette wheel, each flip of a coin, each draw from a deck of cards is an independent event with fixed probabilities. The outcome of the previous spin has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the outcome of the next spin. The roulette wheel possesses no memory, no consciousness, no desire to balance out recent results. Yet our brains, evolved to detect patterns and predict future events based on sequences we've observed, interpret long streaks as unsustainable deviations that must correct themselves. We see 9 blacks and believe we've gathered evidence about the wheel's behavior, when in fact we've gathered nothing but noise. This cognitive error persists with remarkable stubbornness precisely because it feels intuitively true. Pattern recognition served our ancestors well when they were tracking animal migrations or predicting seasonal changes, but it betrays us when applied to truly random events. We see sequences and assume they contain meaningful information, assuming that history exerts gravitational pull on the future. Financial investors fall prey to this fallacy when they believe a stock that has declined steadily must soon reverse course. Sports fans convince themselves that a player in a shooting slump is due for a hot streak. People seeking to conceive children become certain that their luck must change after a series of disappointments. The fallacy embeds itself so deeply in our reasoning because we've normalized it into folk wisdom, turning it into something that feels like knowledge rather than error. Imagine a basketball player who has made 5 consecutive three-point shots, and as they step back beyond the arc once more, the commentators breathlessly declare that they are in the zone, that they are hot, that the momentum is on their side, and surely the next shot will go in as well. The crowd rises to their feet with anticipation, the opposing team calls a timeout in fear, and even the player themselves feels an almost supernatural confidence that this streak will continue indefinitely. Yet when the statisticians and researchers examined decades of shooting data, they discovered something that contradicted this deeply held intuition. The probability of the next shot going in was essentially identical to the player's baseline shooting percentage, regardless of how many consecutive shots they had just made. The hot hand fallacy is the belief that success in the immediate past indicates a heightened probability of success in the immediate future, when in reality, past successes in random or semi-random events tell us nothing about upcoming outcomes. The psychological mechanism underlying this distortion is our brain's relentless need to find patterns, to weave narratives from randomness, to believe that we can predict what comes next based on what just happened. When we witness a streak, our pattern recognition systems, evolved over millennia to help us survive in environments where patterns genuinely mattered, fire with enthusiasm and convince us that we have identified a meaningful signal in the noise. We become so psychologically invested in the narrative of momentum that we begin to make decisions based on it, placing larger bets, taking bigger risks, or allocating our confidence in ways that have no basis in probability. What makes this distortion so persistent despite its logical fragility is that it occasionally appears to be validated by chance alone. Sometimes the player really does make the sixth shot, and we remember that instance vividly while forgetting the many times the streak broke, a phenomenon known as selective memory reinforcement. Imagine a gambler sitting at a roulette table who notices that red has come up 5 times in a row, and they become convinced that black is now due to appear. So they place increasingly larger bets on black in the coming spins, believing they've identified a pattern that will inevitably correct itself. Or consider an investor who observes that a particular stock has risen for 3 consecutive weeks and concludes that they've discovered a genuine upward trend, when in reality those gains were entirely random fluctuations with no underlying momentum. These scenarios illustrate the clustering illusion, a cognitive distortion in which our brains perceive meaningful patterns and trends in what are actually random or meaningless sequences of events. The human mind has evolved to be exceptionally good at detecting patterns because pattern recognition has been crucial for survival throughout our evolutionary history, allowing our ancestors to anticipate dangers and identify opportunities in their environment. However, this same mechanism that once kept us safe now routinely misleads us into finding connections and trends where none genuinely exist, particularly when we examine small samples of data or observe events that occur in close temporal proximity to one another. When random events cluster together naturally, as they inevitably must, our pattern detection system treats these clusters as evidence of an underlying cause or direction, even though mathematics guarantees that random sequences will occasionally produce runs and groupings that feel deeply meaningful. We see this illusion operating everywhere. Sports fans become certain that a player is in a hot streak after a few good games, investors chase momentum stocks that have performed well recently, and medical patients sometimes attribute their recovery to a new treatment when their improvement coincides with the treatment's administration purely by chance. The clustering illusion persists stubbornly in our decision-making because our brains find randomness deeply unsatisfying and almost threatening, as if acknowledging that outcomes are unpredictable feels like surrendering control. Imagine you're scrolling through social media late at night, and you notice that 3 different friends have posted about coffee within the same hour, followed by an advertisement for a coffee brand appearing in your feed moments later. Your mind immediately constructs a narrative. The universe is trying to tell you something about coffee. Perhaps you need to drink more of it, or maybe it's a sign that you should visit that new cafe downtown. You feel a strange sense of connection between these random events, as though invisible threads are weaving them together into a meaningful pattern designed specifically for you to discover. This is apophenia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful connections and patterns in completely random or unrelated data, to see intentional design where only coincidence exists, and to construct elaborate narratives from fragments of information that have no actual causal relationship to one another. The mechanism underlying apophenia stems from the brain's fundamental drive to create order and meaning from the chaos of sensory input surrounding us at every moment. Throughout human evolution, our ancestors who could quickly identify patterns, even false ones, possessed a survival advantage over those who required absolute certainty before acting. A rustling in the grass might be wind, or it might be a predator, and the cost of being wrong about the predator was far greater than the cost of false alarms. Consequently, our neural architecture became exquisitely sensitive to pattern detection, sometimes firing in situations where no actual pattern exists. This mechanism persists in modern life despite having largely lost its evolutionary utility, because the brain operates on the same fundamental principles it always has, preferring false positives to false negatives, preferring to see patterns that aren't there rather than miss patterns that are genuinely important. Imagine you spend an entire week at a luxury resort, with comfortable accommodations, excellent meals, and pleasant activities throughout most of your stay, yet the final day is marred by a delayed flight and a frustrating interaction with hotel staff. When you reflect on that vacation weeks later, your memory and satisfaction tend to be disproportionately influenced by that negative ending, even though it represented only a small fraction of your overall experience. This is the Peak-End rule, a cognitive bias that causes us to evaluate experiences based primarily on the most intense moment that occurred, whether positive or negative, combined with how the experience concluded, rather than on an accurate average of all the moments that comprised it. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to be rooted in how our brains encode and retrieve memories, prioritizing emotional intensity and recency over duration or overall frequency. When we recall an experience, we do not access a complete video recording of every moment, but instead reconstruct it from fragmented emotional snapshots, with the peaks and endpoints serving as the most accessible and vivid anchors for our reconstructed narrative. This explains why a 2-hour medical procedure with significant pain at the end creates a more negative memory than a 1-hour procedure of similar intensity, because our mind weights the final moments more heavily, informing its overall judgment. The persistence of this bias reveals something profound about human memory and decision-making. We are not rational calculators of total utility or average experience, but emotional storytellers who remember and evaluate our lives through the narrative arc defined by climactic moments and endings rather than through balanced mathematical averaging. When a person wins the lottery, they experience what researchers have observed as a temporary surge in happiness that remarkably dissipates within months despite their dramatically altered financial circumstances. This phenomenon reveals a fundamental blind spot in human perception, our tendency to overestimate the impact of any single factor on our overall well-being simply because we are currently focused upon it. The focusing illusion describes how our minds grant disproportionate weight to whatever occupies our immediate attention, causing us to believe that changes in that particular domain will produce correspondingly massive shifts in our life satisfaction, when in reality life satisfaction remains surprisingly resilient and influenced by countless other invisible variables. When you fixate on earning a higher salary, your mind constructs an elaborate fantasy in which that increase will fundamentally transform your existence. Yet research consistently shows that beyond a basic threshold of financial security, additional income contributes surprisingly little to overall happiness. The mechanism operates through a simple cognitive shortcut. Our brains use the ease with which we can imagine or recall something as a proxy for its actual importance, and since we can vividly imagine how a promotion would feel, we conclude it must matter enormously to our future well-being. We persistently underestimate the power of adaptation, that remarkable human capacity to normalize new circumstances and return to our baseline emotional state. The focusing illusion persists so stubbornly because it serves an evolutionary purpose, directing our attention toward immediate, concrete objectives that historically mattered for survival, yet in the modern world, this same mechanism leads us astray. Imagine you are standing in a comfortable room, well-fed and secure, deciding whether to donate money to a stranger living in poverty across the world. Yet when that same stranger arrives at your door asking for help in person, your emotional response shifts dramatically and you find yourself more willing to assist. This is the empathy gap, a cognitive distortion in which we systematically underestimate the emotional states, suffering, and perspectives of others, particularly when they are distant from us in time, space, or social connection. The mechanism operates through what psychologists call psychological distance, a framework that encompasses not only physical separation, but also temporal distance, social distance, and hypothetical distance. When someone or something feels abstract and removed from our immediate experience, we tend to engage our analytical mind and consider their situation through cold logic and cost-benefit analysis. However, when we encounter suffering or need in concrete, vivid, and emotionally immediate ways, our limbic system activates and we respond with genuine compassion. This creates a puzzling paradox in human decision-making, where we might rationally acknowledge that a child suffering from a preventable disease on another continent deserves our help, just as much as a child we could help in our own community. Yet we consistently allocate resources and emotional energy unequally. The empathy gap also explains why we make different choices when we imagine ourselves in hypothetical future situations compared to when we actually experience those situations. We underestimate how much we will care about problems that seem distant, how much physical pain will affect us, and how strongly we will feel emotional responses when they finally arrive. This distortion persists despite our intellectual understanding that distance should not determine moral worth or the urgency of suffering, because our emotional and analytical systems operate on fundamentally different timescales and mechanisms, and the feeling of proximity remains more persuasive to our decision-making than abstract reasoning about universal human equality. Consider a scenario where you have just finished explaining a complex concept to a colleague, and you feel confident that they understood every nuance of what you were trying to convey, only to discover days later that they interpreted your words in an entirely different way than you intended. This experience reflects the illusion of transparency, a cognitive distortion in which we systematically overestimate the degree to which our internal states, intentions, and the clarity of our explanations are apparent to others. We believe that what seems obvious and transparent to us internally must surely be equally obvious to everyone around us, yet the reality is far more complicated. When we hold a belief, understand a concept, or feel a particular emotion, we have complete access to all the context, reasoning, and background information that led us to that position. We know why we believe what we believe, we remember the experiences that shaped our perspective, and we feel the intensity of our emotions directly. From our vantage point, our thoughts seem self-evidently clear, and we assume that merely articulating them should make them equally clear to others. However, other people do not have access to our internal scaffolding, our personal history, or the mental processes that led us to our conclusions. They only hear our words, observe our behavior, and interpret these external signals through their own distinct cognitive frameworks and experiences. The mechanism behind this distortion stems from the fundamental asymmetry in information access that exists between ourselves and everyone else in the world. Our minds have immediate and complete knowledge of our own thoughts, yet we can only infer the thoughts of others through imperfect channels of communication. This leads us to overestimate how much of our internal experience actually gets communicated through our words and actions. We speak a sentence that seems crystal clear to us, forgetting that the listener must reconstruct meaning from sound waves alone, without the benefit of our surrounding context. Imagine sitting in a meeting where your colleague glances at you briefly and then looks away, and immediately your mind constructs an entire narrative about what they were thinking. They were judging your idea, they think you're incompetent, they were silently criticizing your presentation. You spend the rest of the meeting anxious and withdrawn, convinced you know exactly what was running through their mind, despite having zero actual evidence. This is mind reading, the cognitive distortion in which we assume we know what other people are thinking without any factual basis whatsoever. We treat our interpretations of others' internal states as established truth, when in reality we are operating from incomplete information and our own psychological projections. The mechanism behind mind reading operates through a combination of pattern recognition gone awry and our brain's tendency to fill gaps in information with assumptions drawn from past experiences and current anxieties. When we encounter ambiguous social signals, our minds rush to complete the picture by inventing thoughts and motives for others, and this invented narrative feels so coherent and coherent that it quickly solidifies into perceived fact. We then make decisions based on these entirely fabricated mental states. We avoid speaking up in meetings because we're sure people think we're stupid. We distance ourselves from friends because we're convinced they don't actually like us. We remain silent in relationships because we're absolutely certain our partners are disappointed in us. The persistence of mind reading, despite its obvious illogic, reveals something profound about human psychology. We are more comfortable with a negative certainty we've created than with the anxiety of genuine uncertainty. Even when we intellectually recognize that we cannot actually know what someone else is thinking, the discomfort of not knowing feels intolerable, so we unconsciously generate false certainty instead, and this false certainty, though often deeply painful, provides the perverse comfort of feeling like we've solved an unsolvable puzzle. Fortune-telling as a cognitive distortion occurs when we convince ourselves that we can predict future outcomes with certainty, despite having insufficient information or evidence to support such predictions. Imagine a student who, after receiving critical feedback on a single assignment, becomes absolutely certain that they will fail the entire course, or a professional who, following one awkward interaction with their boss, predicts with complete confidence that they will be fired within the month. These individuals are engaging in fortune-telling, projecting current circumstances into definitive future outcomes without acknowledging the countless variables that remain unknown and uncontrollable. The mechanism operates through a collapsing of possibility into certainty, where we treat our anxious intuitions or pattern-matching brain as though it possesses genuine predictive power. We scan our recent experience for confirming details, notice the things that align with our predicted doom, and interpret ambiguous future events through the lens of our predetermined conclusion. What makes fortune-telling particularly insidious is how it feels like realism rather than distortion. It masquerades as prudent concern or realistic assessment when it is actually the mind's attempt to gain a sense of control through false prediction. We believe that if we can simply predict the worst outcome, we might somehow prevent it or prepare ourselves adequately. The distortion persists because prediction itself feels like a form of agency, even when the prediction is unfounded and the agency is illusory. Our brains evolved to detect patterns and anticipate threats, but they were never designed to operate with perfect information, and yet we treat our fortune-telling conclusions as though they were derived from complete knowledge rather than incomplete fear. We have normalized this distortion so thoroughly that we speak of it as intuition or foresight rather than what it truly is, anxious speculation dressed in the clothes of certainty. Imagine you wake up on a Monday morning feeling inexplicably anxious, and within minutes you have convinced yourself that something terrible is about to happen at work, despite having no concrete evidence to support this fear. And when your colleague later mentions a meeting you had forgotten about, you take this as confirmation that your emotional intuition was correct, even though the anxiety preceded the actual trigger by hours and had nothing to do with the meeting itself. This is emotional reasoning in its purest form, the conviction that because you feel a certain way, that feeling must reflect objective reality and must be a reliable source of truth about the world around you. The mechanism operates through a fundamental confusion between the map and the territory, between internal sensation and external fact, where your emotional state becomes mistaken for evidence. When you feel afraid, your mind treats that fear as proof that danger exists. When you feel ashamed, you interpret that shame as confirmation that you have done something worthy of shame. When you feel like a failure, that feeling becomes accepted as irrefutable documentation of your actual capabilities and worth. The psychological roots run deep because emotions do sometimes correlate with reality, which creates a persistent illusion that they are always reliable guides to truth. Your fear of heights exists partially because heights are genuinely dangerous, and your sadness after loss corresponds to an actual loss, so your mind learns to trust emotional signals as shortcuts to understanding. Yet emotions also arise from fatigue, hormonal cycles, arbitrary memories, media consumption, and 1,000 other sources unrelated to present circumstances, and this complexity seems beneath the notice of a mind seeking quick answers. What makes emotional reasoning so resistant to correction is that it operates with a kind of circular logic that makes itself unfalsifiable. The feeling feels true, therefore it is true, and any contradicting evidence is simply misunderstood or not yet revealed. Consider the person who makes a minor mistake during a presentation at work, perhaps stumbling over a single sentence or losing their train of thought for a few seconds, and immediately concludes that the entire presentation was a complete failure and that they have thoroughly humiliated themselves in front of their colleagues and superiors. Or think of the individual who eats a single cookie while on a strict diet and subsequently abandons all dietary restraint for the remainder of the day, reasoning that since they have already broken their commitment, they might as well consume whatever they desire because the day is already ruined beyond repair. This is all-or-nothing thinking, a cognitive distortion in which a person categorizes their experiences, performance, or circumstances into absolute categories of complete success or total failure, with no recognition or acknowledgement of the spectrum of outcomes that exist between these two extremes. The mechanism underlying this distortion operates through a psychological tendency to compress complex, nuanced situations into binary frameworks that feel more psychologically manageable than ambiguous reality. When we encounter something that does not meet our internal standards for perfection, our minds often default to interpreting it as a categorical failure rather than maintaining the more emotionally taxing awareness that most situations exist in varying degrees of partial success and partial shortcomings. This binary thinking creates a false sense of clarity and reduces cognitive burden, even though it fundamentally misrepresents how the world actually functions. The persistence of all-or-nothing thinking is reinforced by cultural narratives that celebrate absolute achievement and perfect performance, while simultaneously portraying anything less than excellence as disappointing or wasted effort. We are surrounded by stories of successful people who supposedly never fail, combined with our tendency to remember our most notable failures with disproportionate vividness, which trains our minds to view experience through this distorted lens of extremes. Imagine receiving feedback on a project you've worked on for weeks, where the reviewer offers 12 comments. 11 acknowledge your strengths, creative problem-solving, and solid execution, while one points out a minor formatting inconsistency in the appendix. By the end of the day, you find yourself replaying that single critical comment over and over, unable to shake the feeling that you failed, that your work was fundamentally flawed, while the 11 positive observations have essentially vanished from your consciousness. This is mental filtering, a cognitive distortion where the mind systematically filters out positive information while allowing negative details to dominate awareness, creating a distorted perception of reality that bears little resemblance to what actually occurred. The mechanism operates through a process of selective attention and memory encoding, where negative stimuli naturally capture our neural resources more readily than positive ones, a survival adaptation that once helped our ancestors identify threats in their environment. However, in modern contexts where actual threats are far less frequent, this same mechanism causes us to discount achievements, compliments, and evidence of our competence, while magnifying setbacks, criticism, and failures until they eclipse everything else in our psychological landscape. We persist in this pattern despite recognizing its illogic, because the human brain has evolved to weight negative information more heavily than positive information, a phenomenon researchers call negativity bias, which means that one critical remark genuinely feels more significant to our nervous system than a dozen affirmations, even when we intellectually understand this makes no rational sense. The filtering becomes so habitual that we develop entire self-narratives built upon selected negative events while systematically ignoring contradictory positive evidence that would logically reshape our conclusions about ourselves, our capabilities, and our worth. Yet we continue to operate from the filtered version without consciously recognizing the selection process occurring beneath our awareness. Imagine you have just completed a major project at work that took months of planning and execution, and your supervisor calls you into their office to praise your efforts and highlight the exceptional quality of your work. Instead of accepting the compliment with gratitude, you immediately begin to mentally minimize what you have accomplished by telling yourself that anyone could have done it, that you simply got lucky with the timing, that the success was really due to your team members' contributions rather than your own efforts, or that the project wasn't actually that difficult or important in the first place. This is the cognitive distortion known as discounting the positive, and it functions as a psychological mechanism that strips away the legitimate weight and significance of your accomplishments, successes, and positive attributes by reclassifying them as somehow unimportant, circumstantial, or undeserved. When you engage in this pattern, you are fundamentally rejecting evidence that contradicts a deeply held negative self-belief, essentially choosing instead to preserve an ingrained narrative of inadequacy or mediocrity, regardless of what objective reality suggests about your capabilities and worth. The mechanism operates through a selective filtering process where your mind automatically reframes positive feedback, achievements, and evidence of competence as exceptions, flukes, or results of external factors beyond your control, while simultaneously treating negative experiences and critical feedback as definitive proof of who you truly are. This distortion persists with remarkable resilience in many people's psychological lives because it has often been reinforced through early experiences, cultural messaging that discourages self-acknowledgement as arrogant, or a learned pattern of deflecting praise as a social courtesy. Over time, this habitual discounting of positive evidence becomes so normalized that individuals rarely recognize they are doing it, instead experiencing it simply as honest self-assessment rather than as a systematic rejection of reality. Consider the moment when you experience a single negative event and find yourself drawing sweeping conclusions that stretch far beyond the immediate circumstance, transforming one isolated incident into a universal pattern that defines your entire reality and future possibilities. You attend a social gathering where your attempt at conversation is met with lukewarm responses, and within moments your mind concludes that you are fundamentally unlikable, that all social interactions will inevitably result in rejection, and that this singular uncomfortable evening represents the definitive truth about your social competence and worth in the eyes of others. The psychological mechanism underlying overgeneralization operates through a process of pattern seeking that has evolved to help us survive by identifying threats quickly. Yet in modern life, this same mechanism causes us to construct sweeping narratives from minimal evidence, treating exceptions as rules and temporary setbacks as permanent destinies. Our brains naturally seek efficiency by categorizing experiences into broader frameworks, but overgeneralization takes this adaptive process and applies it with such aggressive absolutism that a single failure in one domain becomes proof of incompetence in all domains. A single rejection becomes evidence of universal unlovability, and a single mistake becomes a character indictment rather than a learning opportunity. What makes this distortion particularly persistent despite its illogical foundation is that it feels emotionally true in the moment when we experience it, creating a sense of certainty that overrides our capacity for nuance and our ability to distinguish between what happened once and what will always happen, between a particular context and all possible contexts, between a performance on a single day and an assessment of our entire being. Imagine receiving critical feedback during a work presentation, and instead of considering the specific points about your data analysis or communication structure, you internalize the entire interaction as a personal rejection of who you are as a person, spending the evening replaying the moment and questioning your fundamental competence in your field. Or consider a scenario where a friend doesn't respond to your message for several hours, and rather than acknowledging the countless reasonable explanations, such as work obligations, sleep, or simple forgetfulness, you assume you must have said something offensive and spiral into anxiety about the state of your friendship. Personalization is the cognitive distortion wherein you attribute external events, neutral occurrences, or the actions of others directly to yourself and your inherent qualities, transforming ambiguous situations into personal indictments through a lens of self-reference. The mechanism underlying this distortion operates through a fundamental misalignment between where responsibility actually resides and where your mind assigns it, creating a psychological framework in which you become the central cause of circumstances that have nothing to do with you. This happens because the human brain evolved to prioritize threats and to learn from negative experiences, meaning that your attention naturally gravitates toward information that feels emotionally significant and connects to your sense of self, even when the logical evidence suggests the situation has far more complex and impersonal origins. Your brain creates narratives that place you at the center, because this ancient survival mechanism once served a purpose, helping ancestors learn from social rejection and environmental dangers by making such experiences emotionally memorable. Yet in the modern world, this same mechanism persists even as we develop rational understanding that most people's actions result from their own circumstances, pressures, and preoccupations rather than carefully considered judgments about us. Imagine you make a single mistake at work. Perhaps you miss a deadline or miscalculate a figure in a report. And instead of recognizing this as an isolated error within a larger context of generally competent performance, you immediately conclude that you are incompetent, that you are a failure, that this one mistake defines the totality of who you are as a professional. This is labeling, a cognitive distortion where we take a specific behavior or outcome and use it to create a sweeping, permanent identity statement about ourselves or others. The mechanism operates through a kind of conceptual compression where we collapse the complexity of human behavior into a single, rigid category, transforming a moment into a destiny. When someone disagrees with us once, they become difficult. When they arrive late, they become unreliable. When they struggle with a task, they become incapable. We do not say I failed at this task, but rather I am a failure. We do not say he made a poor choice, but rather he is a bad person. The distortion persists because labeling creates a kind of psychological shorthand that feels efficient and explanatory, allowing us to sort the world into neat, comprehensible categories without the exhausting work of nuance and reassessment. It provides an illusion of understanding, a false sense of closure that our minds find comforting. Yet this distortion profoundly influences how we make decisions about relationships, career changes, self-improvement, and our fundamental self-worth. Because once we have applied a label, we tend to interpret all subsequent evidence through the lens of that label, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the label becomes increasingly difficult to dislodge from our perception, even as the original evidence recedes into insignificance. Consider the moment when you wake up in the morning and immediately hear a voice in your mind telling you what you should do with your day, what you should have accomplished by now, what you should be feeling, or who you should have become by this point in your life. This internal narrator speaks with absolute certainty and brooks no argument, presenting a rigid rulebook of expectations that somehow feel both deeply personal and strangely disconnected from your actual circumstances, desires, or capabilities. Should statements are imperatives that we direct toward ourselves and others, declarative sentences that masquerade as objective truths while actually representing internalized demands, often inherited from family systems, cultural conditioning, educational institutions, or absorbed from people we once respected or feared. The mechanism works through a process of cognitive fusion where we bind our sense of identity and worth to the achievement of these shoulds, creating a persistent gap between our current reality and an idealized version of ourselves that exists only in the realm of obligation rather than authentic aspiration. When you tell yourself you should exercise more, you should be further along in your career, you should spend more time with family, or you should feel grateful despite feeling empty, you are not making observations about the world or setting genuine goals, but rather installing programs of self-judgment that run continuously in the background, generating guilt, shame, and resentment whenever reality fails to conform to these arbitrary standards. The psychological power of should statements lies in their peculiar invisibility, for they feel so natural and inevitable that we rarely question their origin or validity. We simply accept them as part of the mental furniture of adult responsibility. Yet the logical problem with should statements is profound, because shoulds collapse the distinction between what is with what we believe ought to be, they eliminate the space for authentic choice, and they transform every action into either compliance or rebellion rather than genuine decision-making. Imagine you receive feedback from your manager during a performance review where they mention that you could improve your communication skills in team meetings, yet they also praise your technical work and acknowledge your reliability as a dependable team member. In the days that follow, the single sentence about communication becomes the dominant narrative in your mind, expanding and consuming your thoughts until it feels like the entire review was a devastating critique of your fundamental abilities as a professional. You begin to interpret every interaction in meetings through this distorted lens, convinced that colleagues are silently judging your contributions, and you find yourself withdrawing from discussions you might otherwise have participated in confidently. This psychological phenomenon, known as magnification, is the tendency to exaggerate the importance, impact, or catastrophic potential of negative events, while simultaneously minimizing or rendering nearly invisible the positive aspects of the same situation. The mechanism operates through a selective attention bias, where your mind acts as though it possesses a zoom lens that can enlarge certain details far beyond their actual significance, transforming minor setbacks into evidence of profound personal failure. This distortion is particularly insidious because it feels entirely justified and reasonable at the moment it occurs. You are not consciously aware that you are distorting reality, but rather believe you are simply recognizing important truths that others might overlook. We have normalized this pattern across cultures and institutions by building narratives around perfectionism and the idea that a single weakness negates numerous strengths, creating an environment where magnification becomes not merely a cognitive error, but a validated way of thinking about ourselves and our capabilities. Minimization occurs when we downplay the significance or severity of something that deserves genuine attention and concern, reducing its emotional weight and practical importance until it becomes almost invisible in our decision-making process. Consider the person who has experienced a troubling interaction with a close friend, perhaps an unkind comment, a broken promise, or a moment of disrespect. Yet when reflecting on it later, They convinced themselves that it was not really that bad, that they were probably overreacting, that their friends certainly did not mean it the way it sounded, and that dwelling on it would only create unnecessary drama and tension in the relationship. The actual hurt they felt becomes reframed as an exaggeration, a temporary emotional spike that should not be given credence or allowed to influence how they perceive the friendship moving forward. This minimization serves a protective function in the moment, allowing us to maintain our preferred narrative about people and situations we value, yet it simultaneously prevents us from processing legitimate concerns and from taking appropriate action when boundaries have genuinely been crossed. The mechanism operates through selective attention and reinterpretation, where our brain actively filters out the full weight of uncomfortable information by comparing the current situation to imagined worst-case scenarios. And since the current situation is rarely the absolute worst possible outcome, we conclude that what happened must have been relatively minor and therefore unworthy of serious consideration. We normalize this pattern because it feels psychologically efficient and socially prudent. Minimization appears to preserve harmony and demonstrates flexibility, generosity, and maturity, all virtues we wish to embody, yet what we are actually doing is training ourselves to ignore signals that deserve attention and to accept treatment we would never accept from ourselves toward others. When a project fails at work, instead of examining the systemic issues, unclear deadlines, or your own role in the miscommunication, you immediately point to a colleague who missed a meeting or a manager who provided insufficient resources, allowing yourself to feel completely absolved of responsibility. When a relationship ends, rather than reflecting on patterns in how you communicate or your own unmet needs, you focus entirely on everything your partner did wrong, constructing a narrative where you are the victim of their actions and they are the villain of your story. When you gain weight despite your intentions to exercise, you blame your busy schedule, your genetics, or the food industry rather than examining your actual choices and behaviors. This is blaming, the cognitive distortion in which you attribute responsibility for outcomes primarily or entirely to external people, circumstances, or forces, while minimizing or completely disregarding your own agency and contribution to the situation. The psychological mechanism operates through several interconnected processes. First, it protects your self-image by externalizing failure and negative outcomes, allowing your ego to remain intact and your self-esteem to avoid damage. Second, it triggers the fundamental attribution error, where you overestimate external factors when explaining others' behavior while underestimating them for yourself, creating an asymmetrical understanding of causality. Third, it provides immediate emotional relief by allowing you to feel wronged or victimized, which paradoxically can feel more comfortable than sitting with the discomfort of personal accountability. What makes blaming particularly insidious is how thoroughly normalized it has become in modern discourse, where blame shifting, finger-pointing, and defensive attribution have become standard responses to failure in professional environments, personal relationships, and public discourse. Imagine a person who works exhausting hours at a job they find meaningless, sacrificing their health, relationships, and present happiness with the implicit belief that their suffering now will eventually be rewarded in some distant future, whether that future is retirement, promotion, or heavenly reward in an afterlife. They endure daily frustration, postpone meaningful experiences, and abandon personal pursuits, all under the conviction that this temporary deprivation will somehow accumulate into a grand payoff that justifies the decades of discomfort. This is the heavens reward fallacy in action, a cognitive distortion where we convince ourselves that suffering in the present is a necessary investment in future happiness, without ever questioning whether that future reward is real, guaranteed, or even worth the price we are paying. The psychological mechanism operates through a kind of deferred gratification logic that assumes the universe keeps accounts, that virtue will be compensated, and that patience itself becomes a currency that can be spent for future gains. We internalize narratives, often inherited from religious or cultural traditions, that frame hardship as noble and necessary, creating a psychological framework where enduring pain becomes a moral act rather than a choice worth examining. The fallacy persists because it serves a comforting function, transforming present suffering into something meaningful rather than meaningless, and it aligns with stories we've been told about how life ought to work. Yet despite having no logical foundation for guaranteeing future rewards based on present sacrifice, we normalize this pattern across modern life, applying it not just to spiritual pursuits, but to career progression, education, relationships, and health decisions, perpetually delaying contentment in exchange for a reward that may never arrive, or, if it does, may feel hollow compared to what was sacrificed to obtain it. When you encounter a situation where someone receives a benefit or advantage that you do not receive, despite believing that both of you have contributed equally or deserve the same treatment, you experience a profound sense of injustice that can color your entire perception of the interaction and the person involved. This is the fallacy of fairness, a cognitive distortion rooted in the deeply human conviction that life should operate according to perfectly balanced rules, where effort matches reward and sacrifice is always acknowledged and compensated accordingly. Imagine a workplace scenario where you and a colleague have both worked late hours on a project, yet your colleague receives public recognition while your contributions go unmentioned, or consider a family situation where siblings receive different amounts of inheritance despite believing their needs are equal. The fallacy of fairness emerges when you assume that the world actually operates according to these principles of perfect equity, leading you to feel victimized when reality inevitably diverges from this expectation. The psychological mechanism at work involves a fundamental attribution error combined with an idealized model of how transactions and relationships should function. Your brain has constructed a mental ledger that tracks inputs and outputs, comparing your investments against those of others and expecting proportional returns, yet this ledger operates on assumptions about fairness that no complex social system has ever actually honored or could reasonably honor. The distortion persists because fairness feels like an objective principle rather than a subjective interpretation of events, and because we have genuinely constructed social systems and moral frameworks that reference fairness as an ideal, making it seem plausible that real life should reflect these standards. The fallacy of change represents a peculiar optimism bias, where we believe that other people will fundamentally alter their behavior or personality in response to our influence, our love, our commitment, or simply the passage of time, despite all evidence suggesting that core personality traits and deeply ingrained patterns remain remarkably stable throughout adulthood. We encounter this distortion most vividly in relationship contexts, where someone might choose to remain with a partner who exhibits harmful behaviors under the assumption that this person will eventually change once they are truly loved or once circumstances improve. Yet the psychological research on personality stability demonstrates that lasting behavioral change requires sustained internal motivation from the person changing themselves, not external pressure or hope from those around them. The mechanism operates through a combination of optimistic bias and what psychologists call the illusion of personal influence, whereby we overestimate our capacity to shape others' fundamental nature while simultaneously underestimating the power of established neural pathways, learned behaviors, and personality structures that have solidified over years or decades. This distortion thrives in contexts where we have emotional investment in another person, because acknowledging that someone is unlikely to change forces us to confront difficult truths about our situation and our choices, truths that might demand uncomfortable action or acceptance. We might believe our difficult family member will eventually become kinder, our unmotivated colleague will suddenly develop ambition, or our emotionally unavailable partner will learn to express vulnerability and intimacy. Yet these beliefs persist despite repeated cycles of disappointment and broken promises. Consider the person in a conversation who, when presented with evidence contradicting their position, immediately shifts the argument to a different angle rather than acknowledging the original point, or the individual who interprets every correction as a personal attack and responds with defensive justification rather than curiosity about alternative perspectives. This cognitive distortion, known as always being right, manifests as an unwavering commitment to defending one's viewpoint regardless of counter-evidence, creating a psychological fortress where admitting error feels equivalent to admitting fundamental inadequacy as a person. The mechanism operates through a deeply rooted need to protect self-image and maintain a consistent internal narrative about who we are and what we know, because our sense of competence and worth becomes fused with our correctness in any given moment. When someone challenges our position, our brain interprets this not as new information to integrate, but as a threat to our identity, triggering defensive responses that prioritize winning the argument over discovering truth. We find ourselves employing selective attention to remember instances that prove us right while conveniently forgetting situations where we were wrong. Or we reframe past mistakes as learning experiences that actually prove our wisdom rather than acknowledging genuine error. This pattern persists despite its logical illogic, because we have normalized the equation that being wrong equals being worthless. A cultural narrative reinforced from childhood through competitive educational systems and social hierarchies that reward appearing confident and penalize apparent uncertainty. The tragedy is that this distortion prevents genuine learning and connection, because growth requires the vulnerability to say, "I did not consider that," or "I was mistaken." Yet we have constructed such fragile self-concepts that these simple acknowledgments feel like catastrophic admissions rather than the natural byproducts of being human and continuously encountering new information. Consider the person who spends hours researching the perfect diet plan, believing that if they simply follow the instructions precisely, they will achieve their desired weight loss, despite having tried 17 different diets over the past decade, each one failing in remarkably similar ways. Or think of the student who becomes paralyzed with anxiety before an exam, convinced that their nervousness is the determining factor in their performance, when in reality they had insufficient time to study the material adequately. Control fallacies emerge from a fundamental misunderstanding about the relationship between our efforts and outcomes in the world, splitting our perception into two dangerous extremes. In the first extreme, known as internal control fallacy, we overestimate our personal agency and believe that we have far more control over external circumstances than we actually do, leading us to take excessive responsibility for events that depend heavily on factors beyond our influence. In the second extreme, called external control fallacy, we swing in the opposite direction and convince ourselves that we are essentially powerless, that our actions matter little, and that our lives are determined by fate, luck, other people, or circumstances beyond our reach. The psychological mechanism underlying these fallacies runs deep into how we construct narratives about causation and responsibility in our lives, because the human brain desperately wants to feel that it has agency and understanding, that the world operates according to comprehensible rules rather than random chaos. When we experience success, we naturally attribute it to our own competence and effort, which reinforces the belief that we control outcomes, while simultaneously, when we fail, we may either blame ourselves excessively for not controlling enough or blame external forces for controlling us too much. This distortion persists remarkably well because it actually serves certain psychological functions, providing us with a sense of security and predictability even when that sense is largely illusory, allowing us to feel less anxious about an inherently uncertain world. Imagine receiving a brief, casual text message from a colleague that simply reads, "We need to talk about your project." In that single moment, your mind may instantly construct an elaborate narrative. They are disappointed with your work, they are planning to reassign you, your career trajectory has just been altered. You spend the next several hours in a state of anxiety, rehearsing defensive explanations and considering worst-case scenarios, only to discover later that the colleague merely wanted to discuss a minor clarification or share some positive feedback. This phenomenon, known as jumping to conclusions, represents one of the most pervasive cognitive distortions we experience in our daily lives, and it operates through a remarkably efficient but deeply flawed psychological mechanism. Our brains have evolved to make rapid assessments based on incomplete information because survival often demanded swift action in the face of ambiguity. When our ancestors encountered rustling in tall grass, they did not pause to gather complete data about whether a predator was present. They reacted based on pattern recognition and probabilistic inference. This ancient adaptation persists in modern consciousness, causing us to fill informational gaps with assumptions drawn from our personal history, fears, and biases rather than from the actual evidence available to us. We construct narratives that feel absolutely certain despite being built on foundations of speculation, and we convince ourselves that our interpretations are logical deductions rather than imaginative leaps. The distortion persists with remarkable tenacity because it often operates unconsciously, happening so rapidly that we experience our conclusions as direct perceptions of reality rather than as mental constructions. We rarely pause to examine the gap between what we actually know and what we have assumed, and we continue navigating our relationships, careers, and social interactions as though our hastily assembled interpretations are established facts rather than provisional hypotheses awaiting verification. Imagine a person who considers themselves deeply environmentally conscious, yet they drive a gas-guzzling sport utility vehicle every single day, take multiple flights per year for leisure travel, and rarely recycle despite having convenient access to recycling programs in their neighborhood. They genuinely believe in climate action and feel genuine concern about the planet's future, posting about sustainability on social media and donating to environmental organizations. When confronted with the obvious contradiction between their stated values and their actual behavior, they experience a profound psychological discomfort, an internal tension that feels almost physically present. This uncomfortable sensation is cognitive dissonance, and it emerges whenever we simultaneously hold two or more conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes, or when our actions contradict our deeply held convictions. The mechanism underlying this distortion is rooted in our need for internal consistency and psychological coherence. Our minds are constructed to organize information in ways that make sense to us, to create a unified narrative about who we are and what we stand for. When reality contradicts this carefully constructed self-image, our cognitive system registers this mismatch as an error, generating psychological tension and discomfort. Rather than simply accepting the contradiction and adjusting either our beliefs or our behaviors, we typically employ elaborate mental gymnastics to reduce this tension without fundamentally changing ourselves. We rationalize our contradictory choices, we minimize the importance of our stated values, we reframe our behaviors as exceptions rather than patterns, or we attack the source of the contradiction as being unfair or misinformed. What persists in most people is a remarkable ability to maintain these contradictions indefinitely, sustaining our preferred self-image while continuing unchanged behaviors that directly oppose our expressed values. Imagine a political candidate you have supported for years is caught in a scandal involving financial impropriety, yet you find yourself spending hours searching for alternative explanations, dismissing credible evidence, and focusing intensely on minor inconsistencies in the opposing narrative rather than confronting the central facts before you. This is motivated reasoning in its most potent form, the unconscious tendency to process information and construct arguments in ways that support conclusions you are already motivated to reach, regardless of what the evidence actually suggests. The mechanism operates through selective attention and interpretation, where your mind becomes remarkably skilled at finding logical gaps in arguments that threaten your existing beliefs, while simultaneously accepting far weaker reasoning when it confirms what you wish to be true. Your brain essentially works backward from the conclusion you desire, and then assembles whatever rational scaffolding it can find to justify arriving there, all while you genuinely feel you are being objective and analytical. This distortion persists because motivated reasoning feels indistinguishable from genuine critical thinking. You experience yourself as carefully weighing evidence when you are actually engaged in sophisticated confirmation bias. The psychological mechanism operates at a level below conscious awareness, which means even knowing about motivated reasoning does not make you immune to it. You encounter this in investment decisions, where you convince yourself that warning signs about a company you have already invested in are temporary setbacks, in relationship dynamics, where you reinterpret concerning behaviors from a loved one through the most generous possible lens, and in health decisions, where you prioritize research supporting your preferred treatment while dismissing equally credible studies suggesting otherwise. Imagine you have spent years believing that a particular diet is the healthiest approach for your body, having read articles about it, discussed it with friends, and structured your entire lifestyle around its principles. Then one day you encounter a comprehensive scientific study from a reputable institution that directly contradicts everything you have been told about this diet, presenting evidence that it may actually be harmful to your long-term health. Rather than immediately reconsidering your position, you find yourself scrutinizing the study for methodological flaws, questioning the researcher's motives, or simply dismissing the findings as an outlier that does not apply to your specific situation. This phenomenon is belief perseverance, the cognitive tendency to maintain our existing beliefs even when presented with substantial evidence that those beliefs are incorrect or outdated. The mechanism underlying this distortion is deeply rooted in how our minds organize information and construct identity. When we hold a belief, we do not store it as an isolated fact, but rather as part of an interconnected web of thoughts, emotions, memories, and self-concept. Our beliefs become woven into our narrative about who we are and how the world functions. When new information challenges a core belief, it threatens the entire structure of meaning we have carefully constructed, creating psychological discomfort known as cognitive dissonance. Rather than endure this uncomfortable state, our minds employ sophisticated defense mechanisms such as rationalization, selective attention, and source credibility questioning to protect our existing worldview. What makes belief perseverance particularly persistent is that it operates largely outside our conscious awareness. We genuinely believe we are being rational and objective when we reject contradictory evidence, not recognizing that our evaluation of that evidence is already filtered through our existing belief system. We have normalized this self-protective mechanism to such an extent that we rarely question why we hold the beliefs we do or whether they deserve the unwavering loyalty we grant them. Imagine two people watching the same news broadcast, and they emerge from that experience with entirely opposite conclusions about what they just witnessed. One person is convinced the report was balanced and factual, while the other is equally certain it was biased propaganda designed to manipulate. Both feel confident they perceived reality objectively, that their interpretation aligns perfectly with how things actually are, and that the other person is simply being irrational or willfully ignorant. This is naive realism at work, the cognitive distortion in which we unconsciously assume that the world we perceive is the world as it actually exists, independent of our own interpretation, while simultaneously believing that anyone who sees things differently must be either uninformed, illogical, or motivated by bias. The mechanism underlying this distortion operates through a profound asymmetry in how we process information about ourselves versus others. When we encounter evidence that conflicts with our beliefs, we tend to attribute this disagreement to flaws in how others are processing information, their access to data, their intelligence, or their hidden agendas, rather than considering that our own perception might be filtered through subjective interpretive lenses. Our brain generates a seamless narrative of reality that feels comprehensive and objective precisely because we are unconscious of the countless filtering processes that constructed it. We do not experience the elimination of information we never noticed, the emphasis we added through attention, or the framework we unconsciously applied to organize what we perceived. What emerges in our conscious awareness feels like unmediated reality rather than a carefully curated interpretation. This distortion persists with remarkable resilience because admitting that our perception might be fundamentally subjective threatens our sense of competence and rationality. Imagine you're sitting in a meeting where your company is considering a major policy change, and you voice your opinion against it with conviction and clarity. Afterward, you genuinely believe that most of your colleagues share your view, even though the vote reveals that 70% actually support the policy you opposed. This disconnect between your perception of how many people agree with you and the actual distribution of opinions represents one of the most pervasive cognitive distortions affecting human judgment and decision-making. The false consensus effect describes our tendency to overestimate the extent to which others share our beliefs, values, attitudes, and behaviors, leading us to see our own perspectives as more common and more representative of the general population than they actually are. When you hold a particular viewpoint, your mind automatically constructs a mental model of the world that assumes your position is closer to the center of public opinion than it truly is, essentially making you believe that reasonable people naturally think as you do. This psychological mechanism operates because we have direct access only to our own thoughts and feelings, and we use ourselves as an anchor point for estimating how others think. We notice and remember instances when people agree with us far more readily than instances when they disagree, creating an illusory pattern of consensus. Additionally, we tend to associate primarily with people who share our values and perspectives, surrounding ourselves with a social echo chamber that reinforces our beliefs and makes our viewpoints seem ubiquitous. The false consensus effect persists despite its logical inconsistency because it serves a psychological function. It protects our self-esteem by suggesting that our beliefs are not idiosyncratic or unusual, but rather reflect the natural, sensible way of seeing the world. We've normalized this distortion so thoroughly that we rarely question why we assume agreement extends far beyond our immediate circle, allowing it to influence everything from political discourse to consumer choices to interpersonal relationships. Consider the moment when a project at work succeeds, and you immediately attribute the victory to your own strategic thinking, your leadership, your foresight, and the long hours you invested in making everything align perfectly. Yet when that same project falters, suddenly external forces emerge from the shadows to claim responsibility. The market shifted unexpectedly, your team members didn't execute properly, the client changed their requirements midway through, or circumstances simply conspired against you despite your best efforts. This asymmetry in how we interpret our own successes and failures represents one of the most pervasive distortions in human cognition, one that operates so smoothly beneath conscious awareness that we rarely notice its influence on our daily decisions and relationships. Self-serving bias describes our tendency to attribute positive outcomes to internal factors like our abilities and character, while simultaneously attributing negative outcomes to external circumstances beyond our control, thereby preserving and enhancing our self-image regardless of objective reality. Psychological mechanism operates through a fundamental motivation that evolved long before logic or rationality: the need to maintain positive self-regard and protect our sense of competence and worth. Our brains are equipped with sophisticated rationalizing machinery that automatically scans any given situation and constructs narratives that serve our ego, narratives so convincing and internally consistent that we genuinely believe them rather than recognizing them as protective distortions. We do this not necessarily through conscious deception, but through selective attention and interpretation, focusing on information that supports our preferred narrative while diminishing or recontextualizing evidence that contradicts it. Consider the moment when your colleague arrives late to a meeting and you immediately think, they're always so disorganized and irresponsible. Yet when you yourself arrive late the following week, your internal monologue shifts entirely. The traffic was absolutely terrible, and my previous meeting ran over, plus my phone died so I couldn't check the time. In this single exchange, we witness one of the most pervasive yet invisible distortions in human reasoning, one that fundamentally shapes how we interpret the behavior of others versus our own actions. The actor-observer bias describes our tendency to attribute the actions of other people primarily to their internal characteristics, their personality traits, their choices, and their dispositions, while simultaneously attributing our own identical behaviors to external circumstances, environmental pressures, and situational constraints beyond our control. When someone cuts us off in traffic, we assume they are a reckless driver with poor judgment, yet when we cut someone off, we blame the sun in our eyes or the confusing road markings. This asymmetry in attribution reveals something profound about how we construct narratives around human behavior, and it operates because of a fundamental difference in the information available to us and the perspective we occupy. When observing others, we see only their actions and have limited access to their internal struggles, their reasoning processes, their contextual challenges, so we default to assuming their personality drives their behavior. When we ourselves act, we have complete access to our thoughts, our pressures, our constraints, our momentary distractions, so we naturally factor these into our explanations. The mechanism is rooted in attention and perspective. Observers focus on the actor because the actor is salient and prominent, while actors focus on their environment because they are immersed in it. Imagine a meeting where your colleague presents an idea that fails to gain traction, and you immediately assume it's because the audience didn't understand it properly, or perhaps the timing was wrong, or the room was too cold and distracting. Yet when your own idea doesn't land, you're certain it's because the concept itself was flawed, or the listeners simply lacked the intelligence to grasp its brilliance. This asymmetry in how we interpret identical outcomes depending on who experiences them is the essence of egocentric bias, a cognitive pattern where we systematically overestimate our own influence on events while underestimating the role we play in others' outcomes. The mechanism operates through a fundamental misalignment in perspective and information access. When something happens to us, we have complete access to our internal thoughts, intentions, and circumstances, making these factors vivid and impossible to ignore. We know we intended well, we're aware of the pressures we faced, we understand the obstacles in our path. This wealth of internal data naturally dominates our explanation of why things occurred the way they did. When evaluating others, however, we lack this interior window, so we default to the most observable element, their behavior itself. We see only their actions, divorced from their justifications, constraints, and mental states, which inevitably leads us to overweight their personal responsibility while overlooking situational factors. This bias persists because it's deeply woven into how human consciousness works, anchored to the only perspective we've ever truly inhabited. We've normalized it so thoroughly that we rarely notice when we're doing it, treating our self-centered interpretations as objective reality rather than recognizing them as the inevitable product of our limited vantage point. Consider the entrepreneur who launches their third business venture with absolute certainty that this time will be different, despite the previous two failures draining their savings and damaging their professional reputation. Or think of the investor who believes they can consistently outperform the market through superior stock-picking ability, ignoring decades of research showing that professional fund managers themselves fail to beat index returns with any regularity. These individuals are experiencing the overconfidence effect, a systematic bias where people overestimate the accuracy of their knowledge, the extent of their abilities, and the likelihood that their predictions about the future will prove correct. The mechanism underlying this distortion operates through several interconnected psychological pathways that have become deeply embedded in how we process information about ourselves and our circumstances. When we succeed at something, we readily attribute that success to our own skill and intelligence, while conveniently assigning failures to external factors beyond our control, a pattern that artificially inflates our sense of personal competence over time. Additionally, we tend to selectively recall and emphasize information that confirms our existing beliefs about our abilities while minimizing or forgetting evidence that contradicts those beliefs. The more familiar we become with a domain, the more confidently we feel we understand its complexities, even though familiarity often breeds an illusion of comprehension rather than genuine expertise. We persist in this overconfidence despite overwhelming evidence because our brains appear to have evolved with an inherent optimism bias that serves certain adaptive functions in contexts where confidence itself generates positive outcomes. Yet this same bias becomes dangerous when applied to domains where mere confidence cannot influence results. Consider a person launching a small business who estimates they have a 90% chance of success within the first year, despite statistics showing that roughly 80% of new businesses fail within that same timeframe. This individual is not delusional or deliberately ignoring facts. Rather, they are experiencing optimism bias, a cognitive distortion that causes us to believe that positive outcomes are more likely to occur to us personally than they are to others or than objective evidence suggests. When a surgeon performs a procedure, they typically believe their complication rates are lower than the hospital average. When a driver navigates traffic, they believe themselves safer than the typical motorist. When an investor enters the stock market, they believe their portfolio will outperform the market despite knowing that most active investors underperform passive indices. The psychological mechanism underlying this distortion operates through several interconnected processes. Our brains naturally seek information that confirms our existing beliefs while filtering out contradictory evidence, a process known as confirmation bias that works in tandem with optimism bias to create a protective bubble around our expectations. Additionally, we tend to attribute our successes to our own abilities and character while attributing failures to external circumstances beyond our control, which means we naturally forecast positive futures because we trust our own competence more than we trust chance or other people's judgment. We also suffer from what researchers call the illusion of control, believing we can influence outcomes far more than we actually can, which inflates our sense of personal agency and reduces our perceived vulnerability to risk. What makes optimism bias particularly persistent is that it often produces positive psychological outcomes in the short term, providing motivation, reducing anxiety, and helping us take action rather than remaining paralyzed by fear. Consider the moment when you receive an invitation to a social gathering several weeks in advance, and rather than feeling excitement about the possibility, your mind immediately begins constructing scenarios in which the event will be awkward, uncomfortable, or disappointing, even though you have no evidence that this will occur. You imagine yourself standing alone in a corner, conversations falling flat, or discovering that the people you hope to see will not actually attend. This is pessimism bias at work, a cognitive distortion wherein we habitually assume that negative outcomes are more likely to occur than positive ones, regardless of what statistical probability or past experience might suggest. The mechanism operates through a systematic filtering of our attention toward threats and unfavorable possibilities while simultaneously downplaying or ignoring evidence of favorable outcomes. Our brains, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, developed a hypervigilant system designed to detect danger before it arrives. And this ancient survival mechanism continues to operate in our modern minds even when the threats we anticipate are social rather than predatory. When we engage in pessimism bias, we are essentially running a mental risk assessment that weights negative possibilities far more heavily than positive ones, sometimes to the point where we convince ourselves that bad outcomes are not merely possible but probable or even inevitable. The remarkable aspect of this distortion is how thoroughly it has become normalized in our culture, where pessimism is often mistaken for realism and cautious negativity is praised as prudent planning. We have constructed elaborate justifications for our tendency to expect the worst, framing it as pragmatism or wisdom, when in reality it often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that sabotages our efforts before we have genuinely tried. Consider the experience of receiving feedback on a project you've spent weeks developing. Your supervisor praises the overall direction, acknowledges your creative approach, and offers constructive suggestions for refinement, yet within hours your mind returns repeatedly to the single critical comment rather than dwelling on the 3 positive observations. You find yourself in an evening spiral of self-doubt, replaying that one moment of critique while the genuine praise fades into background noise. This tendency to give disproportionate weight to negative information over positive information represents what psychologists call negativity bias, a fundamental pattern in how human brains process and prioritize information that shapes nearly every decision we make without our conscious awareness. The mechanism underlying this bias operates at a deep evolutionary level within our neurological systems. Throughout human history, our ancestors faced constant environmental threats that could result in death or serious harm, which meant that noticing dangers was quite literally a survival advantage, whereas missing positive opportunities rarely proved fatal. This asymmetry created a brain that became hypersensitive to threats and negative stimuli, allocating greater cognitive resources to processing potential dangers, storing them in memory more strongly, and allowing them to influence behavior more powerfully than equivalent positive experiences. Neuroscientific research demonstrates that negative stimuli produce stronger and faster electrical activity in the brain compared to positive stimuli of similar magnitude, revealing that this is not merely a psychological preference, but rather a biological predisposition wired into our neural architecture. The remarkable aspect of negativity bias in modern life is how thoroughly it persists despite the dramatic transformation of our environment and circumstances. We no longer live in immediate mortal danger from predators or starvation, yet our brains continue operating according to a threat detection algorithm calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Declinism is the pervasive belief that the world, society, or civilization is fundamentally worse than it used to be, that standards have fallen, that things are deteriorating across nearly every dimension of human experience, and that the future will likely be even darker than the present moment. When someone engages in declinism, they interpret contemporary events through a lens of inevitable decline, selectively noticing evidence that confirms the world is falling apart while dismissing or minimizing countervailing data that might suggest progress, stability, or improvement in various domains. A person might observe social media conflicts and conclude that civility has completely vanished, or witness economic uncertainties and decide that prosperity has become impossible, or note environmental challenges and assume that restoration is futile. The mechanism behind declinism operates through several psychological pathways simultaneously. Nostalgia acts as a powerful distorting filter that makes the past appear more coherent, orderly, and satisfying than it actually was, while negativity bias ensures that current threats and problems feel more psychologically real and important than equivalent positive developments or achievements. Additionally, recency bias means we weight recent difficulties more heavily than long-term trends, so a string of bad news cycles can override decades of measurable improvement in health, literacy, or living standards. The persistence of declinism is particularly striking because it exists almost independently of objective reality in many cases. Humans living in eras of unprecedented prosperity, safety, and opportunity can still feel convinced that decline is inevitable, suggesting that this distortion operates more through emotional resonance and narrative coherence than through rational assessment of evidence. Consider the person who speaks fondly of their childhood summers, remembering endless days of sunshine and freedom, only to glance at old photographs and realize it rained constantly that season, that they were frequently bored, and that many moments were tinged with loneliness or family conflict. This is rosy retrospection, the cognitive tendency to recall the past with disproportionate positivity, smoothing away the rough edges of genuine experience and polishing memories into something warmer and more coherent than what actually occurred. When we look backward through time, our brains do not faithfully retrieve data like a video recording. Instead, we reconstruct the past by weaving together fragments of memory, emotional associations, and the narratives we have constructed about who we are and where we have come from. The mechanism operates quietly and powerfully. Negative experiences fade faster from memory than positive ones do. Our emotional state at the moment of recall influences which aspects of a memory surface first, and we unconsciously edit out details that contradict the overall story we have decided the past represents. Someone might recall a difficult job with increasing fondness after leaving it, not because the working conditions improved retroactively, but because the daily frustrations and humiliations gradually lose their emotional sting while the accomplishments and friendships remain vivid and warm. This distortion serves a psychological function. It protects our sense of self-worth by allowing us to believe we made good choices, that our lives have trajectory and meaning, and that the passage of time has brought growth rather than mere repetition or loss. Yet the persistence of rosy retrospection, despite our intellectual awareness of its mechanisms, reveals how deeply the human mind prioritizes emotional comfort and narrative coherence over historical accuracy, creating a past that feels true rather than one that is true. Consider the moment when someone describes their childhood home with warmth and longing, painting a picture of golden afternoons and perfect summers. Yet when you examine the actual facts, that time was marked by financial instability, family conflict, and genuine hardship that caused real suffering at the moment it was happening. This is nostalgia bias in action, a cognitive distortion that systematically causes us to remember the past as significantly better than it actually was, filtering out negative experiences while amplifying positive emotions and memories. When we make decisions today based on how things used to be, we are often comparing our present circumstances not to historical reality, but to a romanticized and emotionally enhanced version of events that exists primarily in our selective memory. The mechanism at work is both neurological and emotional, as our brains naturally tend to prioritize emotionally significant moments over mundane ones, and positive emotional memories tend to strengthen in our neural networks over time, while negative details fade or become blurred. Additionally, we unconsciously reconstruct our memories each time we recall them, and during this reconstruction process, we inadvertently reshape the narrative to feel more coherent, more meaningful, and ultimately more pleasant than the original experience was. This distortion persists with remarkable resilience because nostalgia serves a psychological function, providing us comfort, identity, and a sense of continuity with our past selves, and we have grown to value these emotional rewards even when they come at the cost of accuracy. We celebrate nostalgia through media, music, and culture, treating it as a charming and harmless emotional indulgence rather than recognizing it as a systematic bias that can lead us to make poor decisions based on false comparisons, whether those decisions involve personal relationships, career choices, or major life directions. Imagine you are evaluating the performance of an employee who has worked for your company for 5 years, and for 4.5 of those years, their work has been consistently excellent, reliable, and valued by the team. However, in the last few months, they have made 3 significant mistakes, missed a couple of deadlines, and generally seemed distracted and less engaged than usual. When it comes time for their annual performance review, you find yourself focused almost entirely on these recent failures, and you begin to form an impression that this person is becoming a liability to the organization. You might even recommend a performance improvement plan or consider letting them go, despite the overwhelming evidence of competence that preceded these recent lapses. This is recency bias, the cognitive tendency to give disproportionate weight and importance to information, events, or experiences that are recent or immediately available in our memory, while simultaneously downplaying or nearly forgetting about information that occurred in the more distant past. The mechanism behind this distortion is rooted in the architecture of human memory itself and the way our attention naturally operates. Recent events remain in our working memory, and are therefore more cognitively accessible, more vivid, and easier to recall than older information that has been consolidated and stored deeper in long-term memory. Our brains, which are fundamentally designed for survival and responsiveness to immediate threats and opportunities, naturally prioritize what is happening now or what happened very recently, because these events feel more relevant to our current circumstances and potential future outcomes. When we make decisions, our minds naturally reach for information that is easiest to access, and because recent memories are neurologically fresher and more prominent, they dominate our judgment and decision-making processes, often to the complete exclusion of relevant historical context. The moment you meet someone for the first time, your brain begins constructing a narrative about who they are, what they believe, and how they will behave in the future, and this initial impression becomes remarkably resistant to change, even when subsequent information contradicts it entirely. Imagine a job interview where a candidate arrives 5 minutes late, stammers through their opening remarks, and seems visibly nervous, yet later demonstrates exceptional competence and deep expertise that they gradually reveal as the conversation progresses, and you may find yourself still anchored to that early awkwardness rather than updating your assessment based on the stronger evidence that emerged afterward. The primacy effect describes this cognitive bias, wherein the first information we encounter about a person, idea, or situation disproportionately influences our overall judgment and continues to shape our interpretation of all future information we receive about that same subject. Psychologically, this occurs because our brains efficiently process initial data by using it as a framework or anchor point against which all subsequent information is compared and evaluated, and once this framework is established, we unconsciously filter new evidence through it, often minimizing or reinterpreting information that contradicts our first impression. We normalize this phenomenon by treating our initial judgments as though they are stable truths about reality, rather than recognizing them as provisional hypotheses that should be actively revised as we gather more complete information. Yet we persist in clinging to these early conclusions with surprising tenacity. The primacy effect persists because updating our beliefs requires cognitive effort and mental flexibility that our brains naturally resist, and admitting that our first judgment was incomplete or partially wrong triggers a subtle discomfort that we often avoid by simply maintaining our original position and selectively attending to information that confirms it. Consider two scenarios presented to a group of people facing a medical decision. In the first scenario, a treatment is described as having a 90% survival rate, while in the second scenario, the identical treatment is described as having a 10% mortality rate. Despite the mathematical equivalence of these statements, research consistently demonstrates that people overwhelmingly prefer the treatment when it is framed in terms of survival rather than mortality, exhibiting measurably different levels of risk acceptance based solely on how the information is linguistically presented. This phenomenon, known as the framing effect, reveals that our decisions are not primarily determined by objective facts or rational analysis of actual probabilities, but rather by the psychological context in which those facts are delivered to us. When information is framed positively, emphasizing gains or successes, our brains tend to become more conservative and risk-averse, preferring to protect what we believe we might gain. Conversely, when identical information is framed negatively, emphasizing losses or failures, we become more willing to take risks in an attempt to avoid that loss, demonstrating that we are far more motivated by the prospect of preventing negative outcomes than by the prospect of achieving positive ones. The mechanism underlying this cognitive distortion appears to involve the way our brains process language and construct mental models of reality. The words we use to describe a situation quite literally shape the neural pathways through which we evaluate it, creating different emotional and intuitive responses even when the underlying mathematical reality remains unchanged. What makes the framing effect particularly persistent is that it operates largely outside our conscious awareness and rational scrutiny, affecting even those of us who are educated about the bias and consciously attempt to guard against it, suggesting that our susceptibility to framing is deeply embedded in the fundamental architecture of human cognition rather than merely a surface-level quirk of lazy thinking. Imagine you are standing in a coffee shop, facing a decision between two drink sizes, a small coffee for $3 or a large coffee for $5. You find yourself genuinely uncertain weighing the value of the extra volume against the additional cost, genuinely torn between the two options. Then the barista mentions a third option, a medium coffee for $4.70, which offers less coffee than the large but costs almost as much. Suddenly, the large coffee becomes obviously attractive, the superior choice, and you order it without hesitation. This shift in preference, triggered entirely by the introduction of an inferior alternative, demonstrates the decoy effect at work within your decision-making process. The decoy effect operates because our brains do not evaluate options in absolute terms, but rather through comparative analysis, measuring one choice against the others available in the moment. When a third option appears that is worse than one alternative, but similar to it in structure, it makes that option seem more valuable by comparison, even though the decoy's introduction has changed nothing about the objective qualities of your original two choices. This happens because humans naturally seek justification for their decisions, and the decoy provides an easy logical pathway for preference formation. Your mind recognizes that choosing the large coffee over the decoy seems rational, and this rationalization bleeds over into making the large coffee seem like the superior choice overall, when in reality you were uncertain about its value moments before. The decoy effect persists in modern life because it operates largely outside conscious awareness, and because it works with remarkable consistency across human populations, making it an invaluable tool for marketers, retailers, and anyone seeking to influence choices without appearing manipulative. We have normalized this distortion because the mechanism feels logical when we construct it retroactively in our minds, transforming what was actually an arbitrary shift in preference into a story about discovering the objectively better option all along. Imagine walking into a coffee shop on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and as you approach the counter, you notice a large poster featuring images of luxurious vacation destinations with pristine beaches and crystal-clear water. You order your coffee, and without consciously thinking about it, you find yourself spending 40% more money than usual, perhaps adding a premium pastry or upgrading to a larger size. Later that day, you make a significant purchase you had been considering, and you approve the expense with surprising ease. The poster did not directly tell you to spend money, nor did it contain any persuasive messaging about financial decisions, yet your behavior shifted measurably in response to environmental cues you barely registered. This is the priming effect, a cognitive phenomenon where exposure to specific stimuli unconsciously influences your subsequent thoughts, behaviors, and decisions without your awareness or intentional participation. The psychological mechanism underlying priming operates through the activation of associations in your brain that remain subtly influential long after the initial exposure has passed. When you encounter certain words, images, or concepts, they activate related neural pathways and associated meanings, creating a temporary state of cognitive readiness that shapes how you interpret new information and what choices seem most appropriate or appealing. Your mind does not compartmentalize these activated concepts. Instead, they seamlessly blend into your current mental state, coloring your perception of reality and guiding your decisions through invisible channels of influence. The remarkable aspect of priming is that this process occurs entirely outside conscious awareness, meaning you cannot simply decide to be unaffected by it through force of will or logical reasoning. Despite our understanding of this effect through decades of psychological research, priming remains deeply woven into the fabric of how we navigate decisions because the activation happens at a level preceding conscious thought itself. Consider a scenario where you hear a particular song on the radio multiple times throughout your week, and by the end of that week, you find yourself genuinely enjoying it, perhaps even seeking it out intentionally, despite having dismissed it as unremarkable when you first encountered it. This shift in preference toward something simply because you have been exposed to it repeatedly is the mere exposure effect, a cognitive pattern so pervasive that it shapes our judgments about everything from music and art to people, brands, and political candidates without our conscious awareness. The mechanism underlying this effect operates at a surprisingly fundamental level of human psychology, rooted in the principle that familiarity breeds comfort and comfort breeds preference. When we encounter something repeatedly, our brain requires less cognitive effort to process it, and this reduction in mental strain is often misinterpreted by our minds as evidence that the thing itself is inherently good, appealing, or trustworthy. Over time, the mere act of repetition becomes conflated with quality, creating a false sense of positivity toward the repeated stimulus. This phenomenon is so deeply embedded in human nature that it has been documented across cultures and age groups, influencing decisions ranging from consumer purchases to romantic attraction to political preferences. Marketers and advertisers have long understood this principle and exploit it deliberately, flooding our environments with repeated exposure to logos, jingles, and brand names, knowing full well that this exposure will gradually shift our preferences and purchasing behaviors toward their products, regardless of objective quality. What makes this distortion particularly insidious is that it operates almost entirely beneath conscious awareness. And even when we become intellectually aware of its existence, we remain vulnerable to its influence because the effect is generated not by logical reasoning, but by the automatic, precognitive systems that govern our emotional responses. Consider a statement you hear repeatedly over weeks and months, something that initially struck you as questionable or perhaps entirely false, yet through sheer repetition, it begins to feel increasingly plausible and true. This is the illusory truth effect, a cognitive distortion where repeated exposure to information makes it feel more accurate and believable, regardless of its actual veracity. Imagine a person hearing a particular claim about a political figure, a health remedy, or a historical event presented multiple times across different sources, and with each encounter, the claim feels more legitimate and less suspicious, even though no new evidence has actually emerged to support it. The mechanism driving this phenomenon is remarkably straightforward, yet profoundly powerful. Our brains develop a preference for information that feels familiar and easy to process. When we encounter something repeatedly, our cognitive system experiences what researchers call fluency, a sense of smoothness and ease in processing that information. This fluency becomes misattributed as a signal of truth, because our minds naturally associate familiarity with safety and accuracy. We have learned throughout our evolutionary history that things we encounter frequently are generally trustworthy aspects of our environment, so this mental shortcut once served us well. However, in the modern information landscape, this ancient heuristic becomes dangerously misaligned with reality. Misinformation can achieve massive repetition through social media algorithms, coordinated campaigns, and the natural tendency of compelling falsehoods to spread more readily than boring truths. The remarkable and troubling aspect of the illusory truth effect is how it persists even when we consciously recognize that repetition alone proves nothing. We might intellectually understand that saying something many times does not make it true, yet we feel its truth more deeply after exposure regardless. This creates a strange tension where our rational mind objects even as our intuitive mind settles into acceptance. Imagine you're scrolling through a restaurant review platform late on a Friday evening, trying to decide where to eat dinner, and you notice that one establishment has 47 five-star reviews, while another nearby restaurant with comparable cuisine and pricing has only 8 reviews, most of which are 3 stars. Without tasting either restaurant's food, without speaking to the chefs, without any direct experience whatsoever, you immediately feel drawn toward the first option, assuming that the sheer volume of positive reviews must indicate superior quality, and you make your reservation there based entirely on what strangers have decided before you. This is social proof, and it operates in nearly every significant decision you make, from the clothes you purchase to the career paths you pursue to the medical treatments you accept. The mechanism is rooted in a deeply practical evolutionary principle. When you lack complete information about a situation and must make a decision quickly, observing what others like you have chosen or endorsed becomes a powerful shortcut for determining the correct action. Because statistically speaking, the consensus judgment of many people has often protected us from making catastrophic errors throughout human history. However, what was once an adaptive heuristic has become something far more problematic in modern environments where we can observe the choices of millions of strangers instantly, where review systems can be manipulated, where marketing algorithms deliberately amplify whatever is already popular, and where the sheer volume of visible consensus can overwhelm our capacity to think critically. Imagine walking into a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning and noticing that nearly everyone around you is ordering the same seasonal drink, the one featured prominently on posters and social media feeds for the past week. You had no particular interest in it beforehand, but as you observe person after person ordering this beverage with apparent satisfaction, something shifts in your decision-making process. You find yourself ordering it too, not because you have tasted it or researched its quality, but because the sheer number of people choosing it seems to validate its worth. This is the bandwagon effect in action, a cognitive distortion where the mere fact that many people believe something or do something becomes, in our minds, evidence that it must be correct or worthwhile. The mechanism operates on a deceptively simple principle. Our brains use social proof as a shortcut for decision-making. When we are uncertain about a choice, we look to what others are doing as evidence of the right path forward. If thousands of people are buying a particular stock, adopting a specific diet, supporting a political candidate, or praising a new technology, our minds interpret this collective behavior as meaningful validation. We unconsciously assume that such large numbers of people cannot all be wrong, that if this many individuals have chosen this option, they must possess information or judgment that we should trust. This heuristic developed for good reasons in our evolutionary past. In small communities, observing what the group did often protected you from danger and guided you toward successful strategies. However, in our modern world of global communication, mass media, and algorithmic amplification, this ancient mechanism has become dangerously unreliable. The bandwagon effect persists because it operates largely outside our conscious awareness, and because it genuinely does sometimes lead to correct conclusions. After all, popular consensus is occasionally accurate. Imagine a corporate boardroom where executives sit around a polished table, each one privately uncertain about a major strategic decision, yet each one remains silent as the room builds momentum toward consensus. The senior vice president voices cautious optimism about entering a new market, and immediately heads begin to nod. Someone adds a supporting comment, another follows. By the time the meeting concludes, what began as a tentative suggestion has transformed into an apparently unanimous conviction, and dissenting voices that might have surfaced at the beginning have retreated into silence. This is groupthink, a cognitive distortion where the human desire for harmony and consensus within a group leads individuals to suppress their own doubts, abandon critical evaluation, and collectively arrive at decisions that none of them would make independently. The mechanism operates through several interlocking psychological pressures. First, as individuals within a group, we experience a powerful motivation to maintain our social standing and avoid the discomfort of disagreement or conflict. We observe that others seem confident in a direction and interpret their confidence as knowledge or insight we may be lacking. We develop an illusion of unanimity where silence is mistaken for agreement, and the absence of vocal opposition becomes evidence that consensus exists. Authority figures within the group often signal their preference early, creating an invisible pressure that shapes how everyone else contributes. The group itself develops a false sense of invulnerability and moral righteousness, dismissing warning signs as hysteria or closed-mindedness. Perhaps most insidiously, the group often develops stereotypes about rival organizations or opposing viewpoints, categorizing skeptics or external critics as simply unable to understand the special circumstances at play. What makes groupthink particularly resilient is that it often produces short-term cohesion and a sense of team unity, which feels valuable and rewarding even as it leads toward decisions that ultimately harm the organization itself. Imagine you are sitting in a doctor's office, and the physician tells you that you need a particular medication for your condition, and without hesitation, you accept this recommendation and begin taking the pills as prescribed, never questioning whether there might be alternative treatments or whether this specific course of action truly aligns with your personal health priorities. Now imagine a similar scenario in a corporate boardroom where a senior executive presents a business strategy, and despite having reservations about its feasibility, the room falls silent in agreement simply because of the title on the executive's business card and the authority they wield within the organizational hierarchy. Authority bias is the cognitive distortion in which we place disproportionate trust and weight on the opinions, recommendations, and directives of people we perceive as being in positions of power, expertise, or social status, often without critically evaluating the actual merit or validity of what they are saying. The mechanism that drives this distortion is rooted in our evolutionary past and our deeply ingrained social structures, where deferring to those with apparent authority was often necessary for survival and social cohesion. And this neurological wiring has persisted into modern times even when the stakes are far less existential. When we encounter someone wearing a white coat, holding a prestigious degree, speaking from a podium, or commanding resources and respect, our critical thinking faculties tend to quiet down, and we enter a state of passive acceptance, assuming that their position must indicate superior knowledge or sound judgment. What makes authority bias particularly insidious is how thoroughly it has been normalized into our institutions and social expectations, to the point where we rarely recognize it as a bias at all, but rather see it as a rational and appropriate response to hierarchical structures that we have all agreed are necessary and legitimate. Consider the moment when you find yourself automatically rooting for your university's sports team against a rival school, or when you feel an instinctive sense of pride watching your country's athletes compete internationally, or perhaps when you're more forgiving of a colleague's mistake simply because they belong to your department rather than another division within the same company. In-group favoritism describes this deeply human tendency to unconsciously privilege, support, and view more positively the people, ideas, and actions associated with groups to which we belong, while simultaneously holding outsiders to harsher standards and viewing their actions with greater skepticism. This bias operates so automatically that we often don't notice it working, yet it shapes countless decisions throughout our lives, from hiring choices to investment recommendations to medical advice we follow. The psychological mechanism underlying this distortion is rooted in our evolutionary past, when belonging to a cohesive group was literally a matter of survival, making tribal allegiance not merely advantageous, but essential for protection, resource sharing, and collective problem-solving. Our brains develop neural pathways that reward us with feelings of safety and identity when we align ourselves with group members, and these ancient survival systems remain active today, even in contexts where they serve no functional purpose. What makes in-group favoritism particularly insidious is how seamlessly we rationalize it, convincing ourselves that our group genuinely is superior, more competent, or more trustworthy than competing groups, when in reality we've simply constructed narratives that justify preferences we've already made on instinctual grounds. We notice every achievement of our in-group members while overlooking their failures, yet we magnify the failures of outsiders while discounting their successes, all the while believing ourselves to be objective observers of reality. When you observe a group of people who belong to a different social category than your own, you tend to perceive them as more similar to each other than they actually are, while simultaneously viewing your own group as composed of distinct individuals with unique characteristics and perspectives. This cognitive distortion emerges when you watch a crowd of people from another culture, political affiliation, age group, or profession, and find yourself thinking that they all seem basically the same, that they probably all think alike, and that their differences are somehow less significant than the differences within your own group. Simultaneously, you recognize considerable nuance, diversity of opinion, and individual variation among the members of your own in-group, treating these people as complex beings with their own distinct motivations and reasons for their choices. The psychological mechanism underlying this distortion operates through several interconnected processes, beginning with reduced exposure and familiarity to outgroup members, which means you simply have fewer opportunities to recognize the full spectrum of their individual differences. Additionally, your brain naturally categorizes people into group memberships as a way of organizing social information efficiently, and once that categorization is made, the brain tends to emphasize the features that define group membership while minimizing the features that create variation within the group. This becomes particularly pronounced when groups are visibly distinct or when you encounter them only occasionally or in limited contexts, preventing you from seeing the complexity of their individual lives. The distortion persists despite its logical inconsistency because it serves psychological functions related to in-group favorability and identity protection, even as we accumulate increasing evidence through modern communication and global connectivity that outgroups are just as internally diverse as our own groups. Imagine walking into a coffee shop and observing a person wearing traditional religious clothing, and before they have spoken a single word or demonstrated any individual characteristic, you have already assigned them a collection of traits, beliefs, and behaviors based solely on that visible marker. This is stereotyping, a cognitive distortion in which we replace the complex reality of an individual human being with a simplified categorical assumption drawn from our accumulated experiences, cultural messaging, and societal narratives. The mechanism operates with remarkable efficiency because our brains are fundamentally pattern recognition machines designed to process enormous amounts of information rapidly. and stereotypes function as mental shortcuts that allow us to navigate the social world without the exhausting work of evaluating every person as a completely unique entity. When our brain encounters someone who appears to belong to a particular group, it automatically retrieves and applies the generalized characteristics we associate with that group. Whether those characteristics come from direct personal experience, media representation, family teachings, or the broader cultural assumptions we have absorbed throughout our lives. This process happens largely outside our conscious awareness, which makes it particularly insidious because we often believe we are making objective observations rather than applying learned templates. We persist in stereotyping despite its obvious logical failures because the occasional confirmation of a stereotype feels like validation, while the far more frequent disconfirmations simply fail to register in our memory with equal force. Additionally, stereotyping persists because it serves psychological functions beyond mere cognitive efficiency. It provides a sense of predictability and control in a fundamentally chaotic social environment, and it reinforces our sense of group belonging by distinguishing who belongs to our in-group versus those who belong to out-groups. Imagine a large organization where a critical error has been made, one that costs the company significant money and damages its reputation. Yet when leadership gathers to investigate what happened, no single person can be identified as the primary cause because the decision was made collectively, discussed across multiple departments, approved by several managers, and implemented by various teams, each believing that someone else was ultimately responsible for ensuring quality control. This is diffusion of responsibility in its most consequential form, a cognitive pattern where individuals in a group setting experience a dilution of personal accountability, believing that the burden of responsibility is shared so broadly that their own contribution to the outcome becomes psychologically diminished. The mechanism operates on a fundamental principle of cognitive ease. Our brains are naturally inclined to distribute responsibility across multiple agents rather than concentrating it on ourselves, because accepting full personal responsibility for a negative outcome creates psychological discomfort, guilt, and potential consequences that our minds work to minimize. When many people are involved in a decision or action, each person unconsciously reasons that others are also accountable, that their individual role is relatively small compared to the collective effort, and that therefore the weight of responsibility cannot rest primarily on their shoulders alone. This cognitive pattern becomes particularly powerful in hierarchical organizations, committee settings, and group environments where decision-making authority is intentionally distributed and where information flow creates natural compartmentalization of knowledge. Imagine a person who donates $100 to a charity on Monday morning, and by Wednesday evening, they find themselves making a series of selfish choices without the slightest twinge of guilt. They cut in line at the coffee shop, ignore a colleague's request for help, spend money frivolously on themselves, or make a decision that prioritizes their comfort over someone else's well-being. The interesting psychological mechanism at work here is called moral licensing, a cognitive distortion where we grant ourselves permission to behave unethically or selfishly because we believe we have already established sufficient moral credentials through previous good actions. The mind, in its infinite capacity for self-deception, treats morality like a bank account where deposits of virtuous behavior create a balance that allows for subsequent withdrawals of questionable conduct. When we perform an action that makes us feel morally elevated, something shifts in our psychological accounting. We unconsciously believe we have earned the right to act less virtuously, that our previous goodness has purchased immunity from the standards we ordinarily hold ourselves to. A person might volunteer at a soup kitchen and then feel justified in being unusually harsh to a family member later that day. Another individual might champion environmental causes publicly and then drive excessively or waste resources without acknowledging the contradiction. The mechanism operates through a process of self-perception and identity reinforcement. Once we have performed a morally praiseworthy action, we internalize an image of ourselves as a good person, and this self-image becomes remarkably sticky. The good person label then paradoxically permits subsequent behavior that would normally conflict with that identity because we have mentally reserved sufficient moral currency to offset the transgression. What makes this distortion particularly persistent is how seamlessly it integrates into our daily decision-making processes. Imagine receiving an unexpected gift from a colleague you barely know, or being invited to lunch by someone who recently asked you for a favor, and suddenly you feel an almost magnetic pull toward returning the gesture, toward obligating yourself in equal measure, even when no explicit request has been made. This is reciprocity bias in its most fundamental form, the deeply ingrained human tendency to feel indebted when someone does something for us, and consequently to feel compelled to do something equally valuable in return, regardless of whether such repayment was ever requested or whether the original gesture was given with ulterior motives in mind. The mechanism operating beneath this bias is rooted in social evolution and cultural conditioning that stretches back through human history. Our ancestors survived in small groups where mutual aid and resource sharing were essential to collective survival, and reciprocal exchanges became the foundation of trust and cooperation within these communities. Over generations, this survival mechanism became hardwired into our psychology, creating what behavioral economists call the reciprocity principle, the conviction that we must treat others as they have treated us. When someone gives us something of value, our brain registers not merely a transaction but a social debt, an imbalance that creates psychological discomfort until equilibrium is restored. This bias persists and proliferates despite its logical fragility because we have normalized it as the bedrock of civilized interaction, calling it gratitude, politeness, and good character rather than recognizing it as a cognitive vulnerability. Marketers exploit this relentlessly by offering free samples, trial periods, and complimentary consultations, knowing that recipients experience an almost irresistible urge to purchase or reciprocate. Politicians and influencers employ the same principle, doing favors for constituents and supporters with full knowledge that this creates psychological obligation. Consider the individual who invested 5 years and significant financial resources into a business venture that has become increasingly unprofitable, yet continues to pour additional money and effort into saving it rather than accepting the loss and moving forward to other opportunities. Or think of the person who remains in an unsatisfying career path or relationship simply because they have already invested so much time and emotional energy into it that the thought of starting over feels unbearable and wasteful. This is commitment bias, the powerful psychological tendency to continue investing in a course of action, belief, or decision simply because we have already committed to it, regardless of whether new information or circumstances suggest that commitment no longer serves our best interests. The mechanism underlying this distortion is rooted in our need to maintain consistency with our past choices and to avoid the discomfort of admitting that those choices were wrong. When we commit to something, we create a psychological stake in it, and our ego becomes intertwined with the success or failure of that commitment. To abandon it would require us to acknowledge a mistake, which triggers cognitive dissonance and threatens our self-image as rational, capable decision-makers. Therefore, we unconsciously rationalize continued investment by focusing selectively on information that supports our original choice while dismissing or minimizing evidence that contradicts it. What makes commitment bias particularly resilient is that it often operates under the guise of positive values like persistence, loyalty, and reliability, qualities we deeply admire and want to see in ourselves. We normalize the sunk cost fallacy as a matter of principle rather than recognizing it as a cognitive trap. This allows commitment bias to persist even in high-stakes situations, where objective analysis would clearly indicate that continued investment is irrational and ultimately more costly than cutting losses and redirecting resources toward more promising endeavors. Imagine walking through a grocery store and noticing a shelf display with a large red sign announcing limited time only or only 3 left in stock, and suddenly that product becomes far more desirable to you than it was moments before, even though nothing about the product itself has changed. You find yourself reaching for it, placing it in your cart, and experiencing a subtle sense of urgency that compels you toward purchase. This is scarcity bias in its most recognizable form, a cognitive distortion that causes us to assign disproportionately high value to things precisely because their availability is restricted or diminishing. The mechanism operates through a straightforward psychological principle. Our brains interpret scarcity as a signal of value and desirability, equating rarity with importance and worth. When something is scarce, our mind reasonably infers that others must also want it, and if we do not act quickly, we will lose the opportunity to obtain it altogether. This triggers what psychologists call loss aversion, where the pain of missing out exceeds the rational evaluation of whether we actually need or want the item. We become fixated not on the intrinsic qualities of the product, but on the possibility of losing access to it, and this loss feels more acute than the gain of possessing it would feel. What makes scarcity bias particularly persistent in modern life is that it has become systematized and weaponized by marketers, retailers, and digital platforms who understand this vulnerability intimately. Flash sales, countdown timers on websites, limited edition releases, and exclusivity claims are deliberately engineered to trigger our scarcity responses, and we have largely normalized these tactics as ordinary parts of commerce. Even when we intellectually recognize that another identical product will likely be available next week, or that the scarcity is artificially constructed for manipulation purposes, the emotional response occurs automatically, bypassing our rational deliberation entirely. When someone tells you that you cannot do something, or that you must do something, a peculiar force awakens within you, an impulse to do precisely the opposite of what is being suggested, regardless of whether that suggestion might actually serve your interests. Imagine a parent forbidding their teenage child from seeing a particular friend, only to discover that the friendship deepens in secret, becoming far more intense than it would have been without the restriction. Or consider a workplace where management implements a strict policy against personal phone use during breaks, which paradoxically leads employees to become more fixated on their devices, checking them constantly the moment the workday ends. Even in advertising, when a company uses language like limited time offer or only available to a select few, consumers experience an urgent compulsion to purchase, not necessarily because they want the product, but because their freedom to choose is being threatened. This psychological phenomenon is reactance, and it operates as a defensive mechanism against perceived threats to your autonomy. The human mind, it seems, interprets any restriction on choice as an assault on personal freedom, triggering an immediate counterreaction where the restricted option becomes paradoxically more attractive and desirable. The mechanism functions through a threat detection system that prioritizes autonomy above rational cost-benefit analysis. When your freedom feels constrained, your brain essentially enters a defensive posture, and the restricted behavior becomes symbolic of your independence rather than merely instrumental behavior. What persists most troublingly about reactance is how it often leads us to make genuinely worse decisions simply to reassert control over our circumstances. We choose harmful actions to prove that nobody can tell us what to do. We reject excellent advice because it came in the form of a directive rather than a suggestion, and we sabotage our own well-being to maintain the psychological sense that we remain the masters of our choices. Consider the employee who has worked at the same company for 12 years, growing increasingly unhappy with stagnant wages, limited advancement opportunities, and a workplace culture that has shifted away from the collaborative environment that once attracted them. Yet they remain in their position despite receiving multiple job offers from competing firms that promise better compensation, more meaningful work, and genuine career growth potential. This person is experiencing status quo bias, a cognitive distortion that leads us to prefer the current state of affairs simply because it is the current state of affairs, regardless of whether alternative options would objectively serve our interests more effectively. The mechanism behind this bias operates through several interconnected psychological forces that work together to anchor us to our existing circumstances. First, there is the simple inertia of familiarity, where the known present feels safer than the uncertain future, even when we have reasonable evidence that the future would be superior. Second, there exists a psychological phenomenon called loss aversion, which causes us to weight potential losses more heavily than equivalent gains, meaning that leaving our job feels like we are losing something concrete and real, while the benefits of a new position feel abstract and uncertain. Third, we develop what psychologists call an endowment effect, whereby we automatically assign greater value to whatever we currently possess simply because we possess it, transforming our mediocre job into something psychologically inflated in worth. The persistence of status quo bias, despite its obvious irrationality, reveals something profound about human nature. We have normalized the idea that changing circumstances requires overwhelming evidence and tremendous motivation, when in reality, maintaining the status quo also requires justification, but somehow feels as though it requires none at all. Imagine you purchase a coffee mug at a thrift store for $3 and you take it home and place it on your shelf where it sits for a few weeks, gradually becoming part of your daily environment. One day, a friend visits and admires the mug, asking if you would sell it to them for $10, and you find yourself hesitating, feeling a resistance that seems entirely disproportionate to the object itself. You might even feel insulted by the offer, insisting that the mug is worth far more than that, perhaps $15 or even $20, despite the fact that identical mugs are available at the same thrift store for the original $3 price. This phenomenon is the endowment effect, a cognitive distortion in which people assign greater value to things simply because they own them, regardless of the actual market value or objective worth of those items. The mechanism underlying this distortion appears to involve a combination of psychological factors that work together to inflate our perception of ownership. When we acquire something, we begin to integrate it into our sense of identity and personal narrative, treating it as an extension of ourselves rather than as an external commodity. This psychological merger creates an emotional attachment that fundamentally alters how we evaluate the object, making the prospect of relinquishing it feel like a loss of something integral to who we are. Additionally, there exists an asymmetry in how our minds process gains and losses, with losses registering as roughly twice as psychologically painful as equivalent gains are pleasurable, a principle known as loss aversion. When we own something, selling it is framed mentally as a loss, triggering this heightened emotional response, whereas the money we would receive is merely a gain, which our minds weight less heavily in the calculation. This distortion has proven remarkably resistant to rational correction, persisting even among economists and decision-making experts who understand it intellectually, suggesting that it operates at a level of cognition that bypasses our conscious, logical reasoning. Imagine you are offered two options to improve your health. The first option reduces your risk of a serious illness by 90%, while the second option eliminates your risk entirely, but requires significantly more time, money, and effort to implement. Most people, when presented with this choice, will select the second option despite the disproportionate cost involved, because the human mind possesses an almost irresistible attraction to the possibility of complete safety. This phenomenon is called zero-risk bias, and it represents our tendency to prefer a reduction in risk to zero over any other reduction in risk, even when that zero-risk option is vastly more costly or less practical than alternatives that would produce nearly equivalent outcomes. The psychological mechanism underlying this bias operates at a fundamental level within our decision-making architecture. When we contemplate risk, our minds do not process probability in a purely mathematical fashion. Instead, we experience an emotional relief that is disproportionately intense when we perceive that a threat has been entirely eliminated rather than merely reduced. The elimination of risk activates reward centers in our brain associated with safety and security, triggering a sense of closure and finality that a 90% reduction, no matter how substantial in practical terms, simply cannot match. This occurs because our ancestors survived by developing an acute sensitivity to threats, and the complete absence of a threat provided genuine evolutionary advantages in environments where any remaining danger could prove fatal. Our modern brains still carry this ancient programming, even though contemporary risks are typically non-binary, and even though perfect safety is often illusory. What makes zero-risk bias particularly insidious is that it persists even when we rationally understand its irrationality. We acknowledge that we are spending enormous resources to eliminate a negligible remaining risk while ignoring far greater dangers that we accept passively every single day. When faced with a choice between two options, one offering clear probabilities and another shrouded in uncertainty, most people gravitationally shift toward the known quantity, even when the unknown option might statistically serve them better. Imagine you are considering two investment opportunities. The first comes with detailed historical data showing it returns between 8 and 12% annually with measurable volatility, while the second is from an emerging market with potential for higher returns but incomplete information about its actual performance trajectory. Despite the second option's theoretical superiority, you find yourself drawn inexorably toward the first, simply because you can quantify its risks and understand exactly what you are accepting. This is ambiguity aversion, the systematic preference for decisions where the probabilities are known over decisions where they remain unknowable, regardless of whether the ambiguous choice is objectively superior. The mechanism operates through our fundamental need for cognitive closure and predictability. Our brains have evolved to process explicit information and calculate known risks, but they stumble when confronted with genuine uncertainty because there is no formula to apply, no historical precedent to reference, no comfortable narrative structure to contain the unknown variable. We experience ambiguity as uniquely threatening because it violates our implicit contract with reality, the unspoken belief that if we gather enough information and apply enough logical reasoning, we can master outcomes and predict futures. Yet we have normalized this distortion so thoroughly that it rarely surfaces as a choice we are consciously making. Instead, it masquerades as prudence, as reasonable caution, as the responsible path forward, when in truth it is simply a preference for the illusion of understanding over the authentic possibility that awaits beyond the edge of our current knowledge. Imagine walking into a grocery store to buy a simple item like yogurt, only to discover an entire aisle containing over 300 varieties, each promising different health benefits, flavor profiles, and nutritional values. You stand there, paralyzed by the sheer abundance of options, spending 20 minutes comparing labels when you initially expected to spend 2 minutes on this task. This is choice overload, a cognitive distortion where the presence of too many options paradoxically diminishes our ability to make decisions and increases our subsequent dissatisfaction with whatever we ultimately choose. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon stems from the human brain's limited cognitive resources and our tendency to engage in excessive comparative analysis when faced with abundance. Each additional option requires mental energy to evaluate, compare, and contrast against all other available choices. And beyond a certain threshold, this cognitive burden becomes so taxing that our decision-making capacity begins to deteriorate. Our brains were evolutionarily adapted to operate within environments of genuine scarcity, where decisions were often binary or limited to a handful of alternatives. Yet modern consumer culture and digital technology have created unprecedented abundance across nearly every domain of choice, from career paths to streaming entertainment to retirement investment portfolios. We have normalized and even celebrated this proliferation of options as inherently positive, treating abundance as synonymous with freedom and personal empowerment, when in reality, research consistently demonstrates that excessive choice leads to decision paralysis, lower satisfaction levels, increased regret, and greater anxiety about whether we have selected the optimal option. Consider the experience of a person who has spent their morning making decisions. They chose what to wear, what to eat for breakfast, which emails to answer first, how to respond to a colleague's request, whether to attend a meeting, and which project to prioritize. By midday, when faced with a seemingly simple choice about where to have lunch or what to work on next, they find themselves paralyzed, irritable, and unable to engage with even minor decisions that would normally feel straightforward. This is decision fatigue, a cognitive state in which the mental resources required to make choices become depleted through overuse, leaving a person less capable of sound judgment, more prone to impulsive choices, and increasingly likely to avoid deciding altogether. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what researchers describe as ego depletion, a psychological state in which the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for executive function, willpower, and deliberative choice, becomes exhausted from sustained mental exertion. Each decision, regardless of its magnitude or importance, draws from a finite pool of cognitive resources, and when that pool diminishes, the quality of subsequent decisions deteriorates noticeably. A person experiencing decision fatigue may make choices that contradict their values, accept the first option presented without evaluation, or simply defer the decision indefinitely, hoping circumstances will resolve the matter without their involvement. What makes this cognitive distortion particularly persistent in modern life is that our contemporary environment demands an unprecedented volume of decisions daily, from trivial selections about digital notifications to consequential choices about career and relationships. Yet we have not evolved corresponding increases in our decision-making capacity. Present bias, also known as temporal discounting or hyperbolic discounting, describes our tendency to prioritize immediate rewards and outcomes over those that would accrue to us in the future, regardless of their actual magnitude or importance. Consider a person who knows that exercising today would significantly improve their health tomorrow, next month, and for decades to come, yet chooses instead to remain sedentary because the discomfort of exercise feels more real and urgent than the abstract promise of future wellness. The same pattern emerges when someone carries high-interest credit card debt while possessing the means to pay it down, because the psychological pain of parting with money today outweighs the mathematical certainty of paying substantially more interest in coming months. Even professionals make decisions under this influence. A manager might delay implementing a system that would save the company hours weekly because the setup effort feels burdensome in the present moment, or a student might procrastinate on a major project despite knowing the future stress of a deadline will be far more acute and damaging to their overall well-being. The psychological mechanism underlying present bias emerges from the way our brains are fundamentally wired to prioritize immediate sensory experience and present circumstances. The prefrontal cortex, which handles abstract thinking about future scenarios, requires more cognitive energy to activate than the emotional and reward centers that respond instantly to present stimuli. This means that future consequences, no matter how severe or certain, feel less psychologically real than immediate discomfort, effort, or resistance. Consider the scenario where you find yourself at a restaurant, presented with two dessert options. You can have a small slice of chocolate cake immediately, or you can wait 2 weeks and receive a substantially larger slice of the same cake. Yet when given this choice, you consistently select the immediate smaller portion despite your stated preference for getting more of what you want. This pattern repeats across countless domains of life, from financial decisions where you spend money today on items you do not truly need, rather than investing that same amount for a significantly larger return in the future, to health behaviors where you choose immediate comfort over delayed but substantially greater well-being, revealing a fundamental quirk in how your brain evaluates value across time. The mechanism underlying hyperbolic discounting operates through a disproportionate weighting of immediate outcomes relative to future outcomes, meaning that as a reward or consequence moves closer to the present moment, its perceived value increases in a curved rather than linear fashion. When something is distant, you can rationally acknowledge that a larger future reward outweighs a smaller present reward, but as that future reward approaches the present, the immediate option suddenly seems far more attractive despite your logical understanding remaining unchanged. Your brain essentially uses different decision-making systems for distant futures versus imminent choices, with the immediate gratification system hijacking the rational planning system when temporal distance collapses. What makes this distortion particularly persistent is that it feels entirely natural and situational rather than like a consistent bias, allowing you to construct narratives about why this specific instance warrants immediate action while maintaining the belief that you make generally sensible long-term choices. You have normalized this pattern so thoroughly that delayed gratification seems like deprivation rather than what it fundamentally is, choosing abundance later over scarcity now. Imagine you are sitting in a restaurant with a friend and you have decided to order a salad because you are committed to eating healthier this month. Yet when the waiter arrives, you find yourself ordering the rich pasta dish instead, later justifying this choice by telling yourself that you showed restraint by not ordering dessert as well. This is restraint bias in action, the cognitive distortion where we systematically overestimate our ability to control our impulses and our capacity to exercise self-discipline in future situations, while simultaneously underestimating how our current desires and environmental pressures will influence our actual behavior when the moment arrives. The mechanism behind this bias operates through a fundamental disconnect between our abstract beliefs about ourselves and the concrete reality of our moment-to-moment decision-making processes. When we envision ourselves in a hypothetical future scenario, we imagine ourselves as rational agents making calculated choices based on our long-term values and intentions. But what actually happens is that we significantly overweight the power of our willpower and underestimate the pull of immediate temptation, social pressure, emotional state, and situational factors that will be present in that moment. We believe we will order the salad, decline the bonus, avoid checking our phones during meetings, or resist spending money we haven't budgeted because we see ourselves as people who possess strong restraint. Yet we consistently find ourselves making the opposite choice when reality intersects with intention. What makes this distortion particularly persistent and troubling is that we have constructed an entire culture around the mythology of willpower as an unlimited personal resource. Celebrating those who claim extraordinary self-control while simultaneously normalizing our own repeated failures by attributing them to external circumstances, rather than recognizing them as inevitable consequences of systematically misunderstanding how we actually function when faced with competing motivations. Imagine you are sitting in a meeting at work, and a colleague makes a critical comment about a project you have been leading. Instead of considering their feedback as genuine concern for the work, you interpret it as jealousy, assuming they feel threatened by your competence and want to undermine you. Later that evening, you find yourself thinking about how competitive and insecure that colleague must be, projecting your own anxiety about being judged onto them as a character flaw. This is projection bias, the cognitive distortion through which we attribute our own uncomfortable feelings, motivations, and character traits to other people, then treat those attributions as though they are objective facts about who those people really are. The mechanism behind this distortion operates through a psychological defense mechanism rooted in our discomfort with acknowledging difficult truths about ourselves. When we experience shame, fear, anger, or insecurity, our minds instinctively seek relief from that emotional burden. One efficient way to gain relief is to externalize these uncomfortable internal states by assigning them to someone else. If you are struggling with jealousy, you may become convinced that others are jealous of you. If you are battling with dishonesty in your own thinking, you may become suspicious that others are being deceptive. If you are wrestling with feelings of inadequacy, you may project competence insecurity onto colleagues or competitors. The psychological mechanism also involves what researchers call attribution bias, where we systematically misunderstand the causes of behavior in ways that protect our self-image. We project not only negative qualities we deny in ourselves, but also positive qualities we desperately wish we possessed, seeing them in people we admire, and then feeling resentful or inferior when reality does not match our projections. What makes projection bias particularly persistent despite its illogical foundation is that it feels like perception rather than interpretation. Consider the moment you anticipate a significant life event, perhaps a promotion at work, a romantic rejection, a major purchase, or a diagnosis from your doctor. You find yourself constructing elaborate narratives about how this event will fundamentally reshape your existence, how it will define your happiness or misery for years to come, how it will alter the trajectory of everything that follows. You imagine yourself months or years into the future, still consumed by the emotional weight of this singular moment, unable to move forward, unable to find joy in anything else. Yet when that event actually occurs, something peculiar happens. The emotional intensity fades far more quickly than you predicted, and life continues with a resilience that your imagination could not have foreseen. This is impact bias, the systematic tendency to overestimate how long and how intensely an event will affect your emotional well-being. Our minds possess a remarkable capacity to imagine future suffering or future joy, but this imagination operates with a fundamental miscalibration, treating temporary states as though they were permanent conditions. We underestimate our own psychological resilience, our ability to adapt, our capacity to find meaning and distraction in the ordinary moments of living. When we lose something we cherish, we genuinely believe the pain will define us forever, yet weeks and months pass and we discover we are still capable of laughter, of hope, of connection. When we gain something we desperately desire, we assume the euphoria will sustain us indefinitely, yet the initial excitement settles into a new baseline, and we begin seeking the next source of satisfaction. The mechanism underlying this distortion involves our difficulty in simulating the actual experience of time and adaptation. We focus intensely on the emotional reaction to the event itself, but we fail to account for the countless small moments, distractions, and adjustments that fill the days and weeks afterward. Imagine yourself at a crossroads in life, contemplating a major decision that feels monumental in the moment. Accepting a job offer in a new city, ending a relationship that no longer serves you, or pursuing a creative passion that frightens you. Before you decide, you engage in what feels like careful deliberation, mentally projecting yourself into the future and attempting to estimate how happy or miserable you will feel months or years from now. You envision yourself in the new city, imagining the loneliness of unfamiliar streets, the anxiety of starting over, and you conclude that this decision will make you deeply unhappy. Or conversely, you fantasize about the liberation and excitement, convinced that this change will transform your entire existence into something magnificent. Then, after you make the decision and live through the experience, you discover something startling. You feel almost exactly as you did before, with only minor variations in your emotional baseline. This is effective forecasting error, the systematic tendency to overestimate how intensely and how long you will feel emotional reactions to future events. The mechanism underlying this distortion involves what psychologists call impact bias, wherein we dramatically overweight the emotional significance of a single life event while simultaneously underestimating our psychological resilience and our capacity to adapt. Our minds treat future emotional experiences as though they exist in isolation, divorced from the continuous flow of ordinary daily moments that actually comprise our lives. We fail to account for hedonic adaptation, the remarkable human ability to return to a relatively stable emotional baseline regardless of whether life circumstances improve or deteriorate. When something wonderful happens, our initial euphoria fades as we acclimate to the new normal. When tragedy strikes, our acute suffering gradually transforms into something more manageable as we integrate the experience into our broader narrative. Imagine you are taking a medical test for a rare disease that affects only 1 in 10,000 people, and the test is 95% accurate. The test comes back positive, and you immediately spiral into panic, convinced you have the disease. A rational observer might ask you to consider the base rate, the underlying probability that anyone in the general population actually has this condition, yet your mind fixates entirely on the positive result and the test accuracy, ignoring the statistical reality that even with a positive result, your actual probability of having the disease remains remarkably low. This tendency to disregard baseline information when making judgments about probability is known as base rate neglect, and it shapes our decisions in ways far more consequential than we realize. The mechanism behind this distortion operates at a fundamental level of human cognition. Our brains are wired to respond powerfully to specific, vivid, concrete information, while abstract statistical information about general populations feels distant and uncompelling. When you see a statistic presented as a percentage or a ratio, it fails to activate the emotional and intuitive systems that drive decision-making, whereas a single case study or a direct personal experience can overwhelm our judgment entirely. This happens because our evolutionary heritage equipped us to pay attention to specific threats and opportunities in our immediate environment rather than to think in terms of broad population averages. And this ancient adaptation proves woefully mismatched to a modern world saturated with statistical information. We encounter base rate neglect everywhere. A person reads about an airline crash and becomes convinced flying is extremely dangerous, despite statistical evidence that flying is far safer than driving, simply because the vivid imagery of the crash dominates their thinking over the baseline rate of aviation incidents. Imagine you're reading a detailed profile about a woman named Linda. The description mentions that she is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice. She participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations during college and has dedicated her career to advocating for environmental causes. Now you're asked to evaluate the probability of 2 statements. First, that Linda is a bank teller, and second, that Linda is a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement. Most people intuitively judge the second statement as more probable than the first, even though this violates a fundamental principle of probability theory. The conjunction fallacy occurs when we believe that a combination of 2 events is more likely to occur than either event alone, even though mathematically, adding additional conditions can never increase probability and can only decrease it or remain the same. The mechanism behind this cognitive distortion relates to how our minds assess representativeness rather than strict probability. When we encounter the detailed description of Linda, her characteristics align so vividly with our stereotype of a feminist activist that we find the conjunction of both traits more mentally available and more easily imaginable than the simpler category of bank teller alone. Our brains unconsciously substitute the question of probability with a question of similarity. Does this person seem like the type to fit this description? The richness of the narrative detail makes the more specific scenario feel more real and coherent, triggering a sense of confidence that distorts our judgment. This fallacy persists in countless real-world decisions because we live in a world of narratives and stories rather than pure statistics. Consider the moment you decide to purchase a particular model of car, and suddenly you begin seeing that exact vehicle everywhere on the road, in parking lots, and in advertisements, as though the world has suddenly filled itself with this single make and model that previously seemed invisible to you. This is attentional bias in its most recognizable form, the tendency of your mind to selectively focus on information that aligns with your current interests, beliefs, or recent experiences, while systematically filtering out everything else that does not match this narrow focus. Your brain is not actually detecting more of these cars. Rather, your attention has been redirected to notice them more frequently, and this shift in perception creates the powerful illusion that they have become more prevalent in your environment. The psychological mechanism behind attentional bias operates through a filtering system in your consciousness that acts like a spotlight, illuminating certain information while leaving the rest in darkness. And this spotlight is drawn toward whatever currently occupies your thoughts or concerns. When you are worried about a health condition, medical terminology suddenly appears in conversations, articles, and social media with alarming frequency. Yet these references existed before your worry began. Your attention simply was not trained to detect them. Similarly, when you are considering a major life decision such as changing careers or ending a relationship, you will notice news stories, overheard conversations, and social media posts that seem to validate whichever choice you are already leaning toward, while dismissing or remaining entirely blind to information that contradicts your emerging preference. This bias influences every significant decision you make because it ensures that the evidence your mind assembles always seems to support the direction you are already heading, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where confirmation feels inevitable rather than constructed. When we observe an exceptional performance or outcome in any domain of life, we tend to attribute that result entirely to the person's skill, effort, or character, while systematically ignoring the role that random variation and chance circumstances play in producing that particular moment. A student who scores perfectly on an examination is praised for brilliance without acknowledging that test performance includes a significant component of luck, test familiarity, and circumstances on that specific day. Yet the same student's average performance the following week is interpreted as laziness rather than regression toward their true mean ability level. This cognitive pattern emerges because our minds are naturally drawn to narratives of causation and character, finding it deeply unsatisfying to accept that variation, randomness, and statistical regression are omnipresent forces shaping outcomes. We notice the exceptional results that stand out in our memory and construct elaborate explanations for them, building entire theories about talent and capability based on peaks that would naturally regress toward average performance without any change in the underlying factors. The mechanism operates through our preference for meaningful stories over probabilistic thinking and our inability to internalize that extreme results, by mathematical necessity, tend toward the middle on subsequent measurements. We observe a company experiencing extraordinary quarterly profits and conclude that the leadership possesses exceptional strategic vision, ignoring that some portion of that success stems from fortunate market conditions, competitive circumstances, and random business variation that will likely shift. When the same company experiences diminished returns the following quarter, we judge the leadership as having failed rather than recognizing that regression toward the mean is a mathematical inevitability.